Hey guys, tonight we begin a story that happened on a summer morning in 1683, when the people of Vienna woke up to find the horizon had disappeared. Not because of fog, not because of a storm, but because an army so massive, so utterly incomprehensible in size had surrounded their city that the dust from 170,000 men and horses literally blocked out the sun. Imagine waking up, walking to your window and seeing darkness. A living, breathing darkness made of soldiers. This wasn't just an army. This was the end of the world knocking on Europe's door. And here's the twist that still haunts historians today. If just 3 hours had gone differently on one September afternoon, you and I might be having a very different conversation right now. The language we speak, the culture, we know the entire Western world as we understand it, all of it hung by a thread in those 3 hours. So tonight we're going back to 1683 to a siege that wasn't just about one city. It was about whether Europe itself would survive. Now, before we dive into this incredible journey together, I need your help. If you enjoy these stories, if they help you unwind, learn something new, or just make your night a little more interesting, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if you genuinely enjoy it, okay? I want real people here who love history as much as I do. And hey, drop a comment below, telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Are you in bed in California drinking tea in London? I'm genuinely curious about who's sharing this moment with me. Alright, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise. And let's step back 342 years to the summer when everything changed. So let's set the stage here, because 1683 wasn't just another year. By this time, the Ottoman Empire, this colossal Islamic superpower centered in what's now Turkey, had been expanding for nearly 300 years. 3 centuries of conquest. Think about that for a second. That's longer than the United States has even existed. The Ottomans had swallowed up the Byzantine Empire. They'd taken Constantinople, that jewel of Christianity that had stood for 1,000 years, and renamed it Istanbul. They'd conquered the Balkans, most of Hungary, they'd pushed into Eastern Europe, and they'd been hammering at the gates of the Christian West for generations. This wasn't just a political war. This was a clash of civilizations, the cross versus the crescent. And honestly, for most of those 300 years, the crescent was winning. Now imagine being a regular person living in Europe during this time. Your grandparents told you stories about the Turkish threat. Your parents lived in fear of it. And now you're an adult and that same empire is still there, still growing, still pushing westward like an unstoppable tide. It must have felt inevitable, you know? Like maybe this was just how history was going to go. Maybe the future belonged to the Ottoman Empire. But here's where 1683 gets different. This wasn't another border skirmish. This wasn't the Ottomans taking some fortress nobody had heard of in the middle of nowhere. This was them going straight for the heart. They were going for Vienna. Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire, the seat of the Holy Roman Emperor, the beating heart of Catholic Europe. If you wanted to draw a line on a map and say, this is where Christian Europe lives, Vienna would be right in the middle of that line. It was the guardian of the West, the last major city standing between the Ottoman Empire and the soft underbelly of Western Europe, places like Germany, France, Italy. Lose Vienna and suddenly the doors are wide open. Suddenly the Ottomans have a clear path to Bavaria, to the Rhine, to, well, potentially everywhere. It's like if someone broke into your house, but instead of just taking your TV, they're standing in your living room with a map of your entire neighborhood. That's the level of threat we're talking about. And the Ottomans knew it. That's why they'd tried before. Back in 1529, that's 154 years earlier, Suleiman the Magnificent, probably the greatest Ottoman sultan who ever lived, had brought an enormous army to Vienna's walls. He'd laid siege to the city. He'd bombarded it. He'd thrown everything he had at it. And Vienna held. Barely. Just barely. But it held. And Suleiman had to retreat, and that failure haunted the Ottoman Empire for over a century. So fast forward to 1683, and the Ottomans are back. But this time they're not just back, they're bringing the full force of their empire. We're talking about an army that contemporary sources estimated at anywhere from 150,000 to 300,000 men. Now, historians today think the real number was probably around 170,000, which is still absolutely mind-blowing for the time period. To put that in perspective, the entire city of Vienna had maybe 50,000 people living in it. The defenders, they had about 11,500 soldiers and maybe another few thousand civilian volunteers. Do the math on that. Even with the most conservative estimates, Vienna was outnumbered 15 to 1. 15 to 1. Those are not good odds. Those are maybe we should start praying odds. But here's what makes this story so gripping, why it's kept me up at night reading about it, why I had to share it with you. This wasn't just about numbers. See, the thing about the Ottoman army in 1683 is that it wasn't just big, it was good. These were the same forces that had conquered half of Eastern Europe. They had the elite janissaries, these legendary infantry units that were basically the special forces of their day. They had engineers who could dig siege tunnels like they were building subway systems. They had cavalry that could move faster than news could travel. They had artillery that could pound fortress walls into rubble. And leading this massive force was a man named Kara Mustafa. And we're going to talk a lot about him in the next part because his ego might be the most important character in this entire story. But for now, just know this. He was ambitious, he was ruthless, and he was absolutely convinced that he was going to succeed where Suleiman the Magnificent had failed. He was going to take Vienna. He was going to crack open Europe like an egg. He was going to become a legend. And standing in his way, a city that was running out of food, running out of ammunition, running out of hope. An emperor, Leopold I, who literally fled his own capital when he heard the Ottomans were coming, just packed up and left. Good luck with that, basically, and a desperate collection of defenders who knew that if Vienna fell, the consequences would echo through history forever. So why am I telling you this story now in 2025 about something that happened in 1683? Because here's the thing that still amazes me. We came so close, so terrifyingly close. There were moments during that siege, and we'll get into them in excruciating, heart-pounding detail, where Vienna was hours away from falling. Hours! Not days, not weeks. Hours! If the Ottoman miners had been just a little luckier, if the defenders had been just a little less determined, if the relief force had arrived just a day or two later, if history is full of these razor-thin margins. But this one was different. Because this wasn't just about one city surviving or falling. This was about the entire trajectory of Western civilization. Think about the world you live in today. The language you speak, the values you hold, the culture you're part of, all of it has roots that run back through European history. And all of that was hanging by a thread in the summer of 1683. That's not hyperbole. That's not me being dramatic for the sake of the story. That's just what was at stake. And here's what makes it even more incredible when help finally did come, when that relief force finally arrived. The battle that decided everything, the battle that determined whether Vienna stood or fell, whether Europe survived or transformed beyond recognition, that battle lasted 3 hours. 3 hours. Most of us spend longer than that binge watching a TV show. But in 3 hours on September 12, 1683, the fate of a continent was decided by the largest cavalry charge in human history. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're not at September yet. Right now it's July. It's hot. Vienna is surrounded. The bombardment is starting. People are scared. And somewhere in the Ottoman camp, Kara Mustafa is planning his triumph, dreaming of glory, convinced that history is about to remember his name forever. And you know what? He was right about that last part. History did remember him, just not the way he hoped. But that's a story for when we meet again. Right now, I want you to sit with this image, a city of 50,000 surrounded by an army of 170,000. The sound of drums in the Turkish camp, the smell of gunpowder in the air, the knowledge that winter is coming, and if help doesn't arrive before, then the city will starve long before it falls to an assault. This is where Vienna found itself in July of 1683, trapped, alone, and desperately hoping that somewhere out there someone was coming to help. Next time we're going to talk about Vienna itself, why this city was worth so much blood, why it was called the Golden Apple, that everyone wanted to bite into, and why the Ottoman Empire was willing to bet everything on capturing it. But more than that, we're going to meet the people inside those walls, the emperor who abandoned them, the commander who stayed, the ordinary citizens who refused to surrender even when surrender seemed like the only rational choice. Because this isn't just a story about armies and empires, it's a story about human beings facing impossible odds and somehow finding the courage to stand firm. So dim those lights a little more, let that fan keep running. And I'll see you in just a moment as we step inside the walls of Vienna and discover what it meant to be the golden apple that everyone wanted to claim. So here's the question that keeps historians arguing over coffee even today. Why Vienna? I mean, really, why this city? The Ottoman Empire had conquered dozens of major cities by 1683. They'd taken Constantinople, They'd rolled through the Balkans, they'd captured fortresses that people swore were impregnable. So why risk everything, and I mean everything, on one city in the middle of Europe? The answer is actually pretty simple, and pretty fascinating. Vienna wasn't just any city. Vienna was the prize. And to understand why we need to talk about something that might sound boring at first, but I promise it's not rivers. Stay with me here. The Danube River. You've probably heard of it maybe from that old waltz, the Blue Danube. This river is the second longest in Europe. It flows from Germany's Black Forest all the way to the Black Sea, cutting through the heart of the continent like nature's highway. And Vienna. Vienna sits right on the Danube at one of the most strategic points imaginable. Think of the Danube as the Amazon of medieval Europe. Everything moved on this river. Grain from Hungary, wine from Austria, timber from Bavaria, gold and silver from the mines. If you controlled the Danube, you controlled the lifeblood of Central Europe. And if you controlled Vienna, you controlled the Danube. It's that simple and that important. But it gets even better or worse depending on which side you're on. Vienna wasn't just on the Danube. It was at the crossroads of the major overland trade routes too. Roads from Germany going east. Roads from Italy going north. Roads from Poland going south. Every merchant, every army, every idea that wanted to move through Central Europe had to pass through or near Vienna. The city was basically a medieval toll booth for half of Europe's economy. Now imagine you're the Ottoman Empire. You've conquered everything to the east and south. You've got the Balkans, you've got most of Hungary, you're looking at the map and there's Vienna sitting there like a locked door. And on the other side of that door, the rich, soft, undefended lands of Germany, Bavaria, maybe even France. Vienna isn't just blocking your expansion. It's blocking your access to the wealthiest part of Europe. That's why the Ottomans called it the Golden Apple. And honestly, that's not marketing hype. That's just accurate. Vienna in 1683 was rich. We're talking about a city that was the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, which, wasn't actually very Roman or particularly holy by this point, but it was still an empire, and empires have money. Lots of money. The Habsburg dynasty that ruled from Vienna had been accumulating wealth for generations. They had palaces filled with art and gold. They had treasuries that could fund entire wars. They had wine cellars, and this detail always makes me smile, wine cellars that were legendary across Europe. The aristocrats in Vienna weren't just rich, they were own multiple castles, and don't remember which one you left your favourite horse at. Rich. And here's where it gets kind of darkly funny when Emperor Leopold heard the Ottoman army was coming. You know what he did? He didn't stay to defend his city, he didn't give a rousing speech to inspire the troops. Nope. He fled. Just left. Packed up his court, his family, and this is the part that tells you everything about his priorities. He made sure to take the imperial silver and the royal jewels with him. Can you imagine being a regular person in Vienna, watching your emperor load up wagons with treasure and roll out of town while an army of 170,000 is marching toward you? The message is pretty clear. Good luck, guys. Hope you make it. Gotta go save these candlesticks. They're really valuable. Leopold fled first to Linz, then all the way to Passau, getting further and further away from the danger. History describes him as bookish pious, a composer. Someone who probably should have been a priest instead of an emperor. And you know what? I think history's being polite. The guy abandoned his capital. That's not bookish. That's something else entirely. But here's the interesting thing, and this is where Vienna's story gets complicated. The people who stayed, they weren't all heroes either. They were just stuck. The population of Vienna was about 50,000 people, and most of them couldn't leave even if they wanted to. Merchants had their shops. Craftsmen had their workshops. Farmers from the surrounding countryside had taken refuge in the city and had nowhere else to go. These weren't soldiers. These weren't trained warriors. These were bakers and blacksmiths and tavern owners and grandmothers. And yet somehow they had to defend a city that was only partly ready for what was coming. See, here's the thing about Vienna's defences. They were good, but they weren't great. The city had walls, yes. It had bastions, those angled fortifications that were state-of-the-art in the 1600s. It had a moat. It had cannon positions. On paper, Vienna looked like a tough nut to crack. But in reality, those fortifications were showing their age. Some of the walls dated back decades, even centuries. There were weak points places where the stone was crumbling, places where a really determined enemy could break through if they were willing to pay the price in blood. And that's before we talk about what Vienna didn't have. The city didn't have unlimited gunpowder, it didn't have unlimited cannonballs, it didn't have unlimited food. A siege wasn't just about who had the stronger walls or the bigger army. A siege was about who could outlast the other, and Vienna, surrounded and cut off from the outside world, was starting that contest with a finite amount of everything. The defenders numbered about 11,500 trained soldiers, plus maybe another few thousand volunteer civilians who'd been given weapons and a crash course in this is how you defend a wall. That's it. That's what Vienna had to work with. Compare that to Constantinople in 1453, which fell to the Ottomans after a 53-day siege. Constantinople had bigger walls than Vienna. Constantinople had more defenders. Constantinople had the advantage of being a peninsula protected by water on three sides. And Constantinople still fell, so when people in Vienna looked at their situation in July 1683, they had every reason to be terrified. They were outnumbered, they were outgunned, their emperor had abandoned them, and the last time the Ottomans really committed to taking a major Christian city, they'd succeeded. The shadow of Constantinople hung over everything. But, and this is crucial, Vienna had something Constantinople didn't have in 1453: hope. Not baseless hope, not delusional hope, but actual rational hope. Because unlike Constantinople, Vienna wasn't completely isolated. Vienna was part of a network of alliances. There were other Christian powers out there who had every reason to want Vienna to survive. The question wasn't whether help would come. The question was whether it would come in time. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you're waiting for help, and every hour feels like a day? Maybe you were stuck somewhere or dealing with an emergency and you knew someone was coming, but you didn't know when. That feeling, that endless grinding anxiety of will they make it in time, that was Vienna in the summer of 1683. The man in charge of the defense, the guy who had to somehow make this work, was Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg. And here's what you need to know about Starhemberg when the Ottoman emissaries came to the city gates under a flag of truce and demanded surrender, when they promised that if Vienna gave up now, the people would be spared. Starhemberg's response was legendary. He basically told them, and I'm paraphrasing here because the actual quote is in German, "Come and try, I'll fight to the last drop of blood." That's not bravado. That's not him being macho for the sake of it. That's a man who understood that surrender to the Ottomans meant slavery or death for most of the population. That's a man who knew that if Vienna fell, every city in Germany would be next. That's a man making a choice to stand firm even when the smart, safe, logical thing might have been to negotiate. And standing behind Starhemberg were 11,500 soldiers and a few thousand terrified civilians who had to trust that this choice was the right one. That help was coming, that they wouldn't die for nothing. So when we talk about Vienna being the golden apple, we're not just talking about wealth and trade routes and strategic geography, we're talking about symbolism. We're talking about Vienna as the idea of Christian Europe making a stand. We're talking about a city that represented everything the Ottoman Empire wanted to prove it could take and everything the Christian West desperately needed to prove it could defend. The stakes couldn't have been higher. And in July 1683, as the Ottoman army arrived at the gates and began setting up their siege works, everyone in Vienna knew it. They could see the tents spreading out across the horizon like a canvas city. They could hear the drums beating in the Turkish camp. They could smell the smoke from the fires of 170,000 men cooking their dinners. And somewhere in that vast enemy camp was a man who was absolutely convinced that Vienna would be his, that the golden apple would fall into his hand, that history would remember him as the conqueror who finished what Suleiman the Magnificent had started. His name was Kara Mustafa, and if Vienna was the prize everyone wanted, he was the man who was willing to destroy his own empire to claim it. Which brings us to the real question at the heart of this entire story. How does a man's ambition, his ego, his personal demons end up deciding the fate of nations? Because here's the thing about the Siege of Vienna that makes it so compelling. Yes, it's about armies and empires and the clash of civilizations. But at its core, it's about people. It's about an emperor who fled a commander who stayed, and a grand vizier whose pride was about to cost hundreds of thousands of lives. In just a moment, we're going to meet that grand vizier. We're going to step into his tent, get inside his head, and understand how someone could make the series of decisions that would ultimately doom the Ottoman Empire's dreams of European conquest. Because this isn't just a military story, it's a psychological one. And trust me, the more you learn about Kara Mustafa, the more you realize that sometimes the greatest threat to an empire isn't the enemy outside the gates. It's the man leading the army. There's this moment in history, and I think about it a lot, where everything hinges on one person's character. Not their strategy, not their resources, not their army size. Just who they are as a human being, their ego, their blind spots, their demons, and the Siege of Vienna. This is one of those moments, because the man leading the Ottoman army to Vienna's gates wasn't just a military commander. He was a walking disaster waiting to happen, and somehow nobody saw it coming until it was way too late. His name was Merzifonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha. Kara means black in Turkish. Some say it referred to his dark complexion. Others say it was about his dark personality. And after you hear his story, you might agree with that second interpretation. Let me paint you a picture of where this guy came from, because his origin story actually explains a lot. Kara Mustafa was born around 1634 or 1635 in a small village near Merzifon in what's now Turkey. His father was a sipahi, basically a cavalry soldier. Not wealthy, not powerful, just a regular military man who died in battle when Kara Mustafa was young. So right from the start, this kid is growing up without a father, probably watching his mother struggle, probably feeling like he got dealt a bad hand in life. But then something happened that changed everything. His father had served under a man named Köprülü Mehmed Pasha, and the Köprülü family was political royalty in the Ottoman Empire. Think of them as the Kennedys or the Rockefellers of their time. When Köprülü Mehmed heard about his old soldier's son, he did something remarkable. He took the boy in, adopted him essentially, raised him as his own, gave him an education, taught him the art of Ottoman politics. Now you'd think this would make Kara Mustafa grateful, right? Humble even. Here's a kid who went from poverty to privilege, from nobody to somebody. But here's the thing about people who rise from nothing to everything. Sometimes they develop this chip on their shoulder, this need to prove they deserve it, this hunger that can never be satisfied. And Kara Mustafa, he had that hunger in spades. He was smart, let's give him that. He navigated the deadly waters of Ottoman court politics and survived. He married into the Köprülü family, his adoptive sister actually, which was totally normal for the time, but definitely keeps things complicated. And he climbed step by step, position by position, until in 1676 he became Grand Vizier. That's basically the Prime Minister, the second most powerful person in the entire Ottoman Empire, answering only to the Sultan himself. And this is where his character really starts to show. Because once Kara Mustafa had power, he wanted more. Always more. His predecessor, his brother-in-law Fazıl Ahmed Pasha, had been relatively cautious. He'd maintained the status quo, fought some border wars, kept things stable. But Kara Mustafa looked at that and thought, that's not enough. I need to be remembered. I need to be legendary. I need to be the one who finishes what Suleiman the Magnificent started. You see that word need? That's the key to understanding everything that went wrong. This wasn't about what was best for the Ottoman Empire. This wasn't about careful strategic planning. This was about Kara Mustafa's ego, his need to prove himself worthy of the name he'd been given, the family that adopted him, the position he held. And here's where his character gets really dark. English diplomats at the time described him as greedy, corrupt. They said he imposed crushing taxes on European merchants, that he essentially ran protection rackets. One ambassador called him a grievous oppressor of Christendom. But it wasn't just Europeans he oppressed. His own people feared him too. There's this story, and I'm warning you, it's brutal, about what Kara Mustafa did to Polish prisoners during his campaigns before Vienna. He didn't just execute them, he had them flayed alive, skinned, and then he had their skins stuffed and sent to the Sultan as trophies, as gifts. Like, hey boss, look what I did for you. Take a moment with that. What kind of person does that? What kind of mind thinks, you know what would really impress people? Human taxidermy. That's not military strategy. That's not even effective terror tactics. That's just cruelty for cruelty's sake. That's someone who enjoys causing pain. And yet this was the man leading 170,000 soldiers toward Vienna. This was the man the Ottoman Empire trusted to execute possibly the most important military campaign in its history. Now here's where it gets really interesting, and by interesting I mean tragic, because Kara Mustafa made a series of decisions that in hindsight basically guaranteed his failure, and historians have been arguing about these decisions for over 300 years. Were they mistakes born from ignorance, or were they the inevitable result of a narcissist who refused to listen to anyone who questioned him? Let's talk about his first huge mistake: artillery. When you're besieging a city with modern fortifications, you need heavy siege guns, big, powerful cannons that can pound stone walls into rubble. The Ottomans had these. They'd used them to devastating effect at Constantinople in 1453. They knew how to build them, how to transport them, how to use them. But Kara Mustafa decided not to bring them to Vienna. Instead, he brought light field artillery cannons that were great for battles in open fields, but basically useless against thick fortress walls. Why would he do this? Some historians think he was in a hurry and didn't want to slow down his march. Others think, and this is darker, that he didn't want to damage Vienna too much because he wanted to loot it intact. He wanted the treasure, the wealth, the glory of capturing this rich city with all its riches still inside. Think about that logic for a second. He prioritized potential loot over actually winning the siege. That's like a poker player going all in not because they have a good hand, but because they're already spending the money they haven't won yet. Second mistake, fortifications. When you're besieging a city, you build siege works around it, trenches, walls, artillery positions. That's standard. But you also build defensive works facing outward to protect yourself from a relief army. This is basic stuff. Siege Warfare 101. Every military commander in 1683 knew this. Kara Mustafa didn't do it. He surrounded Vienna, started digging trenches, positioned his artillery, and then just assumed nobody would come to rescue the city. Or if they did, he assumed his army was so big and so powerful that it wouldn't matter. The arrogance of that decision is stunning. It's like leaving your front door unlocked because you're convinced nobody would dare rob you. Third mistake, and this one really gets me, he wasted the Janissaries. Okay, so the Janissaries were the elite infantry of the Ottoman army. These guys were legendary. They were essentially special forces troops, the best of the best, trained from childhood to be warriors. They were the units you saved for the critical moment, the decisive breakthrough. Kara Mustafa used them for suicide attacks. Day after day, he'd send small groups of Janissaries at the walls where they'd get torn apart by musket fire and cannon shot. He'd lose dozens, sometimes hundreds, for basically no gain. And he kept doing it. For weeks. Military historians look at this and just shake their heads in disbelief. It's like using a surgical scalpel to hammer nails. Why did he do it? Some say he was impatient. Some say he didn't understand siege warfare as well as he pretended. But there's another theory, and it's the one that makes the most sense to me. He was so convinced Vienna would surrender that he didn't want to commit to a full assault. He kept probing testing, hoping the defenders would just give up so he could waltz in and claim his prize. That's not military strategy. That's wishful thinking. That's a gambler doubling down because they're convinced the next card will be the winner. And here's maybe the most shocking part of all. Kara Mustafa revealed his plan to attack Vienna at the last minute. Like the army was already on the march, they were already deep into Habsburg territory, and only then, when they reached a town called Székesfehérvár on June 25th, did he announce, "By the way, we're going for Vienna, not the border fortresses." His subordinates were shocked. Two of them, the Crimean Khan Murad Gure and the governor of Budapest, Ibrahim Pasha, openly objected. They said it was too ambitious, too risky, not what the Sultan had authorized. And you know what Kara Mustafa did? He insulted them. Publicly humiliated them. Because how dare they question his genius? This is textbook narcissism, by the way. The inability to accept criticism. The conviction that you're always the smartest person in the room. The need to dominate and humiliate anyone who disagrees with you. And when you're leading an army of 170,000 men into the most important campaign of your empire's history, those personality traits aren't just flaws, they're catastrophic. Here's a question for you. Have you ever worked with someone like this? Someone so convinced of their own brilliance that they couldn't see the obvious problems everyone else could see. Someone whose ego was so fragile that questioning them felt dangerous. I bet you have. We've all met that person. Now imagine that person commanding an army. The thing is, for a while, Kara Mustafa's confidence seemed justified. He marched his army across Hungary in record time, just 105 days from Istanbul to Vienna, arriving on June 14th. That was actually impressive. Suleiman the Magnificent had taken until September to reach Vienna in 1529. So Kara Mustafa was ahead of schedule, his army was intact, and Vienna was right there in front of him, ripe for the taking. In those early days, he probably felt invincible. He probably looked at Vienna's walls and thought, "This is it. This is where I become immortal. This is where I surpass Suleiman himself." But here's the thing about ego, it blinds you. It makes you see what you want to see, instead of what's actually there. And what was actually there was a determined garrison, a well-fortified city, and time, that great equalizer, slowly turning against him with every passing day. The Ottomans lost nearly 20,000 men just during the siege before the relief army even arrived. 20,000. Think about that. That's not a small town. That's a small city worth of deaths. Disease ravaged the Ottoman camp because Kara Mustafa didn't maintain proper sanitation. Desertion rates climbed. Maybe 25% of his army just walked away, tired of the grinding, pointless attacks, tired of watching their friends die for inches of ground. And through it all, Kara Mustafa pressed on, convinced that victory was just one more assault away. One more push. One more day. Just a little longer. He didn't know it yet, but his ego had already doomed him. Every decision he'd made, the light artillery, the lack of defences, the wasted janissaries, the refusal to listen to advice, all of it was building toward a disaster that would echo through history. Because while Kara Mustafa was dreaming of glory beneath Vienna's walls, something was happening that he'd failed to prepare for. Something that his missing defensive fortifications, his scattered scouts, his divided command structure had left him vulnerable to. Help was coming. An army was gathering. And when it arrived, every single mistake Kara Mustafa had made was about to matter more than anyone could have imagined. But we're not there yet. First, we need to understand how Vienna survived long enough for that help to arrive. We need to see what those 2 months of siege were actually like, the mining, the explosions, the disease, the starvation, the desperate moments when the walls came down and the fate of the city hung by a thread. That's where we're going next. Into the siege itself, into the longest summer of Vienna's life and possibly the longest summer in European history. So stay with me, because this story is about to get intense. Picture this. It's spring 1683, and you're standing in the city of Edirne, the Ottoman Empire's western capital in what's now Turkey. The date is April 1st, and spread out before you as far as your eyes can see is an army that defies comprehension. Not just soldiers, but an entire civilization on the move. And somehow, against all logic, this massive force is about to march nearly 1,000 miles to Vienna without falling apart. Let me tell you something that doesn't get talked about enough. Moving 170,000 people from point A to point B in 1683 is basically impossible. And I don't mean difficult. I mean it shouldn't work. The logistics alone should have crushed this campaign before it even started. But Kara Mustafa pulled it off, and understanding how he did it and what it cost, that's key to understanding everything that came after. So let's break down what we're actually talking about here. When historians say 170,000 men, they're not just counting soldiers. This was an entire mobile city. You've got the janissaries, maybe 60,000 of them, the elite infantry we talked about earlier. You've got cavalry units from all over the empire, Sipahis from Anatolia, Delhi, horsemen from the Balkans, Tatar light cavalry from Crimea. You've got engineers and sappers, the guys who dig the siege tunnels. You've got artillery crews with their cannons and wagons full of gunpowder. But then, and this is the part that really blows my mind, you've got support staff. Blacksmiths to shoe the horses, cooks to feed everyone, medics to treat the wounded and sick, religious leaders to maintain morale, interpreters because this army spoke dozens of languages, supply managers tracking food and water for all these people, herders managing the livestock, sheep, cattle, camels, all marching along to provide fresh meat and transport. Oh, and speaking of animals, estimates suggest the Ottoman army had somewhere between 100,000 to 300,000 animals with them. Horses for cavalry and officers, camels for heavy transport, yes, camels in Central Europe, which must have been quite a sight, oxen for pulling the cannon, sheep and cattle for food. Each of those animals needs water, needs grazing land, needs rest. Do you have any idea how much food 170,000 people eat in a day? Take your daily food consumption and multiply it by 170,000. Now do that for 105 days. The numbers become astronomical. We're talking about supply trains stretching for miles, wagons full of grain and rice and dried meat, constant foraging from the countryside, careful rationing, and still the knowledge that if anything goes wrong, if a supply convoy gets lost, if a bridge collapses, if the weather turns, people are going to starve. And here's the kicker, the Ottomans had actually gotten good at this. They'd been doing it for centuries. They had this system, this infrastructure of roads and supply depots and bridges they'd built or improved over generations. In the years before 1683, Grand Viziers had been specifically investing in making the route from Istanbul to the Habsburg border more passable. They'd repaired roads, built new bridges, established logistics centres where supplies could be stockpiled and redistributed. This wasn't improvised. This was planned. The ammunition, the cannon, the gunpowder, all of it had been forwarded from across the empire to staging areas in the Balkans months before the army even marched. This was Ottoman military machinery at its peak efficiency. Love them or hate them, you have to respect the organisational genius it took to make this work. But efficiency has a dark side, doesn't it? Because as this massive army marched through the Balkans and into Hungary, it didn't just travel through the countryside, it consumed it. Fields were stripped, villages were emptied of food, anyone who resisted was killed or enslaved. Contemporary sources, and these numbers are horrifying, record that during the Ottoman advance and the early siege period, 220 people were kidnapped from the Austrian and Hungarian borderlands and taken as slaves, not soldiers, civilians, men, women, children, gone. Let me break that down for you because the numbers are specific and that specificity makes it worse. 6,000 men, 215 married women, 922 unmarried women under the age of 26, and 093 children. Those aren't estimates. Those are recorded counts. Someone kept track, someone wrote them down in ledgers like they were recording sheep. That's what this march meant for the people in its path. Not just an army passing through, a catastrophe, a storm that swept people away from their homes, their families, their lives into slavery in the Ottoman Empire. Some would be ransomed back eventually. Most wouldn't. And the army marching toward Vienna carried this trail of suffering behind it, like a shadow. Now let's talk timing, because this is where Kara Mustafa's ego actually worked in his favour, at least initially. The campaign officially started on April 1st, 1683. By June 14th, the Ottoman army had reached Vienna. That's 74 days of marching. Add in the time to fully deploy and surround the city, and you get to July 14th when the siege officially began, 105 days total from departure to siege. Compare that to Suleiman the Magnificent's campaign in 1529. He left Istanbul in May and didn't reach Vienna until late September, months longer. And by the time he got there, his army was exhausted, autumn was coming, and he had to retreat before winter made operations impossible. Kara Mustafa learned from that mistake. He moved fast. He didn't waste time on smaller fortresses along the way, he just blew past them, leaving small forces to watch them, but not bothering with lengthy sieges. His goal was Vienna, and he wasn't going to let anything slow him down. In purely military terms, this was actually smart. The element of surprise, or at least speed, was on his side. But here's where things get weird and kind of darkly funny in a historical irony sort of way. Kara Mustafa was moving so fast, being so aggressive, that he didn't actually tell anyone the plan was to attack Vienna until the last minute. The official campaign orders from Sultan Mehmed Thif authorized operations as far as Győr and Komárom castles in northwestern Hungary. Border fortresses, not the imperial capital. So the army's marching and the commanders are assuming they're going to besiege some fortresses, maybe push the border forward a bit, standard stuff. And then on June 25th, when they reach Székesfehérvár, a town about 40 miles from Vienna, Kara Mustafa announces, "By the way, we're going for Vienna." Imagine being a commander in that army. You've been marching for almost 3 months. You're tired. Your men are tired. And suddenly the boss tells you, surprise, we're attacking the most heavily defended city in the Habsburg Empire, the one place that if we fail, it's going to be a disaster for everyone involved. Two commanders, Crimean Khan Murad Giray and Ibrahim Pasha, the Beylerbey of Buda, actually objected. Openly, in front of other officers. They basically said, this is insane. This isn't what we planned for. This isn't what the Sultan authorized. And you know what Kara Mustafa did? He humiliated them, insulted them publicly, made it clear that questioning his decisions was not acceptable. Murad Giray was so angry that later when the siege went badly, he basically refused to cooperate properly, and Ibrahim Pasha. After the eventual defeat at Vienna, Kara Mustafa executed him as a scapegoat. So those commanders' fears were pretty well founded as it turned out. But in June 1683, there was no stopping the momentum. The army kept moving. And on June 14th, Ottoman scouts first saw Vienna in the distance. Try to imagine what that moment was like. You're a soldier who's been marching for over 2 months. You've crossed mountains and rivers, slept in tents in the rain, eaten whatever rations you were given. You've seen your friends get sick, seen stragglers left behind. And now, finally there it is, the golden apple, Vienna. This wealthy, beautiful city sitting on the Danube with its church spires and palaces visible in the clear summer air. For many Ottoman soldiers, this must have felt like the culmination of everything. This is what they'd been marching toward. This is what all the suffering had been for. They'd heard stories about Vienna's wealth, the gold, the art, the wine cellars, supposedly beyond imagination, and now it was right there just waiting to be taken. But if you were standing on Vienna's walls that day looking out at the horizon, you saw something very different. You saw dust, enormous clouds of dust getting closer and closer. You heard drums. The Ottoman army loved their drums, massive kettle drums that could be heard for miles beating out rhythms that were meant to intimidate and terrify. And they worked. Imagine hearing that sound getting louder and louder day after day, knowing that each beat brought the enemy closer. And then the Ottomans arrived, and Leopold remembered the emperor who was supposed to be defending his capital. He finally realized this wasn't just a border raid. This was the real thing, and he panicked. He'd been in denial right up until he could literally see the dust clouds. Some sources say he didn't evacuate the royal family until the last possible moment, when the Ottoman advance guard was almost at the suburbs. He had to be convinced to leave, and when he finally did go, he took the imperial treasury with him, but left the city's defenders without clear orders or adequate supplies. Can you imagine being a soldier in Vienna's garrison watching your emperor flee? Watching the wagons full of silver and jewels roll out of the city while you're expected to stay and fight? That had to sting. That had to raise questions about what exactly you were fighting for. But the people who stayed, and remember most of the 50,000 civilians, couldn't leave even if they wanted to. They watched the Ottoman army arrive and deploy. And it must have been one of the most terrifying sights in human history. The army didn't just show up. It spread out. Like watching a flood in slow motion, the Ottoman forces surrounded the city on three sides. The fourth was blocked by the Danube River. Tents went up by the thousands. Ottoman soldiers started building their siege works, trenches, artillery platforms, forward positions. The engineering corps began surveying the walls, looking for weak points. Supply wagons rolled in endlessly, bringing food, ammunition, cannon. The army was transforming from a marching column into a siege force right before Vienna's eyes. And here's a detail that really captures the psychological warfare of the moment. Leopold, before he fled, had ordered the suburbs of Vienna burned. Everything outside the city walls, houses, churches, shops, everything was put to the torch by Habsburg forces. Scorched earth. The idea was to deny the Ottomans shelter and clear the firing lines for the city's artillery. So when the Ottomans arrived, they found a ring of ash and rubble around the city, and they used it. The smoke from the still-burning buildings concealed their movements from Habsburg gunners. The ruins provided cover for their forward positions. Leopold's defensive measure actually helped the attackers. Just another example of how this campaign was plagued by unforced errors on both sides. July 14th, 1683. That's the date historians mark as the official start of the siege. By then, the Ottoman army had completely surrounded Vienna. The bombardment began, not the full assault yet, just ranging shots, testing. The defences starting to soften up the walls. And inside the city, the defenders knew what was coming. 2 months. That's how long the siege of Vienna would last. 60 days of hell. 60 days of explosions and disease and starvation and fear. 60 days of wondering if help would come in time, if the walls would hold, if any of them would survive to see autumn. The Ottoman army had marched 105 days to get here. They'd crossed a continent, consumed entire regions, left a trail of slavery and destruction in their wake. They'd arrived ahead of schedule with superior numbers, with momentum and confidence on their side. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. But here's what Kara Mustafa didn't know, yet couldn't know. Those 105 days of marching had used up time he couldn't get back. Every day spent travelling was a day closer to autumn, closer to winter, closer to the weather, turning and making retreat necessary. He'd arrived early, yes, but that just meant he had to finish the siege before his initial advantage turned into a disadvantage. And more importantly, those 105 days had given Europe time. Time to realise what was happening. Time to panic. Time to start assembling a response. Because while the Ottoman army was marching toward Vienna, desperate messages were being sent across Europe. Pleas for help, appeals to Christian unity, offers of money and titles and land in exchange for troops. The march was over, the siege was beginning, and the clock was ticking not just for Vienna, but for the Ottoman Empire itself. Though nobody knew it yet, those 105 days of marching were leading toward 3 hours that would change everything. But first, Vienna had to survive. And to understand how remarkable that survival was, we need to go inside those walls. We need to see what 2 months of siege actually meant. The mining, the countermining, the explosions, the diseases with names like the Red Flux that killed thousands. The moments when the walls came down and survival seemed impossible. The heroes you've never heard of who held the line when anyone else would have broken. That's where we're headed next. Into the longest summer any of those people would ever know. into a siege that tested human endurance to its absolute limit. So stay close, because the easy part, the marching, is over. Now comes the real nightmare. Close your eyes for a second and imagine you can hear it. The sound that became the soundtrack of Vienna's summer in 1683. Not church bells, not street vendors, not music from the taverns. No, it's the constant thunderous boom of cannon fire. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 60 straight days. Boom, boom, boom! A rhythm that shakes the walls, rattles the windows, makes sleep impossible, drives people slowly insane. Now, add the smell. Gunpowder smoke so thick it hangs over the city like fog. Sewage backing up because the drainage systems are damaged. Bodies both human and animal that can't be buried properly because there's nowhere safe to dig. And underneath it all, something worse, the smell of disease. The red flux, they called it. A form of dysentery so severe that it turned your insides to liquid and killed you within days. And it was everywhere. This is what the Siege of Vienna actually meant. Not the grand strategy we've been talking about. Not the politics or the egos. This is the reality. For 50,000 civilians and 11,500 soldiers trapped inside those walls, this became their entire world. And they had to survive it for 2 months, never knowing if today would be the day the walls came down, the day the Ottomans broke through, the day it all ended. Let's start with the most terrifying part, the mining. Because the Ottoman engineers were masters of this dark art, and it's something that doesn't get enough attention in the history books. When we think about sieges, we imagine armies attacking walls, right? Soldiers charging with ladders, battering rams, that kind of thing. But by 1683, that was almost obsolete against modern fortifications. Vienna's walls were too thick, too well designed. You couldn't just knock them down, so instead you went under them. Ottoman miners and these guys were specialists trained for years in this work. They'd start digging tunnels from their siege trenches toward the city walls. We're talking about tunnels sometimes hundreds of feet long, dug through clay and rock and mud shored up with wooden beams as they went. The goal was to get underneath a section of wall, pack the tunnel with gunpowder and blow it sky high. Create a breach that infantry could pour through. Now here's what made this absolutely terrifying for the defenders. You could hear them digging. If you put your ear to the ground in certain parts of the city, you could actually hear the sound of picks and shovels scraping through earth somewhere below you. Imagine that, knowing that somewhere beneath your feet enemy soldiers are digging their way toward you, and you can't see them, can't fight them, can't stop them. You just have to listen to them getting closer. So Vienna's defenders had to countermine. They'd dig their own tunnels trying to intercept the Ottoman tunnels before they reached the walls. And sometimes they'd succeed, they'd break into an Ottoman tunnel, and then you'd have underground battles in these cramped, dark, suffocating spaces. Men fighting with knives and short swords in tunnels, barely wide enough to crawl through, by candlelight never quite sure which direction was which or whether the tunnel was about to collapse on top of you. Other times the defenders would try to flood the Ottoman tunnels by digging drainage channels, or they'd pack their own tunnels with explosives and try to blow up the Ottoman tunnels before the Ottomans could blow up the walls. It was this insane game of three-dimensional chess, played in the dark underground with death waiting around every corner. And here's a detail that really captures the horror of it. Sometimes the tunnels would collapse. Just cave in either from poor shoring, or from vibrations from other explosions, or from hitting groundwater. And when that happened, the miners, Ottoman or Viennese, didn't matter. They'd be buried alive. Dozens of men at a time trapped in the dark, suffocating under tons of earth, with no hope of rescue, because digging them out would take too long and was too dangerous. How many men died this way? We'll never know exactly, but we know the Ottoman engineers lost thousands during the siege. Thousands! Not in glorious battle, not charging walls or fighting hand-to-hand, just buried alive in the dark doing their jobs. That's the unglamorous, horrifying reality of siege warfare that paintings and movies never show you. And the explosions. Oh man, the explosions! When a mine did work, when the Ottomans successfully packed a tunnel with gunpowder and lit the fuse, the blast was catastrophic. We're talking about tons of gunpowder detonating in a confined space underground. The ground would literally heave upward like a wave on the ocean. Buildings near the wall would crack or collapse. The wall itself would burst apart, sending chunks of stone the size of carriages flying through the air. The noise was so loud it could be heard miles away. And in that moment of chaos, dust and smoke everywhere, stone still falling, people screaming the Janissaries would charge. They'd been waiting in their forward trenches sometimes for days, just waiting for that explosion. And the second it happened, they'd run for the breach, climbing over the rubble, trying to get into the city before the defenders could recover and seal the gap. The Viennese defenders had a system for this. They'd station quick reaction forces behind every vulnerable section of wall soldiers who did nothing but wait for breaches to appear so they could rush to fill them. And time again it came down to seconds. Literally seconds. The Janissaries would hit the breach, the defenders would arrive just in time, and there'd be this brutal, desperate fight in the rubble, while smoke and dust made it almost impossible to see or breathe. Historical records show that Vienna endured 18 major Ottoman assaults during those 2 months. 18 times that the Ottomans thought they had a breakthrough, thought this was the moment. And 18 times the defenders held, but each time cost lives. Each time left fewer men to defend the next attack. Each time made victory seem a little less likely. Have you ever been so exhausted that you can't think straight anymore, where everything feels like you're moving through water and simple decisions become impossible? That's where the defenders were after about a month. They were getting maybe 2 or 3 hours of sleep per day in shifts, always ready to jump up and run to wherever the next attack was coming from. They were malnourished because food supplies were getting low. They were wounded. Most of the garrison had some kind of injury by the end, even if it was just cuts and bruises from flying debris. And then there was the red flux. This disease dysentery, it spread through the city like wildfire. The water supply was compromised. The sewage system was damaged by the bombardment. People were living in cramped, unsanitary conditions. Perfect storm for disease. And once you got it, you were done. Maybe you'd survive for a week, getting weaker and weaker, maybe just a few days. Either way, you couldn't fight, you could barely move, you just faded away. Thousands of Viennese civilians died of the red flux. The exact number isn't known because record keeping kind of broke down when you were in the middle of a siege and people are dying faster than you can count them. But contemporary sources describe the streets being lined with sick and dying people. The churches turned into makeshift hospitals, priests giving last rites to dozens of people per day. And here's what's darkly ironic. The Ottomans had the same problem. That lack of sanitation Kara Mustafa tolerated in his camp. It came back to bite him. The red flux hit the Ottoman army too, maybe even worse, because they had more people crammed into a smaller area. Remember, I mentioned they lost about 20,000 men during the siege before the relief army even arrived. A huge chunk of those deaths were from disease, not combat. So both sides were rotting away basically. Racing against time and disease and exhaustion, seeing who would collapse first. It was a siege, yes, but it was also a war of attrition at its most brutal, not glorious. Not heroic, just grinding day after day, watching people die from bullets and bombs and disease and exhaustion, wondering when your turn would come. Let me tell you about one specific moment that really captures how close Vienna came to falling. There was this ravelin that's a type of freestanding defensive work in front of the main walls that became absolutely crucial to the defence. The Ottomans attacked it relentlessly because if they could take it, they'd have a perfect position to bombard the main wall up close. The defenders knew this ravelin had to hold, but it was getting absolutely pounded. Day after day of bombardment, then mining attempts, then infantry assaults. The soldiers defending it were running out of ammunition, running out of food, watching the fortification literally crumble around them. Military planners had estimated this ravelin might hold for 3, maybe 4 days under sustained assault. It held for 7 days. 7 days of the defenders fighting in a position that was supposed to be abandoned after 3 refusing to retreat, because they knew that if they did, the city was finished. And when they finally had to withdraw because the ravelin was just too destroyed to defend anymore, they'd bought crucial extra time for the defenders to strengthen the main wall behind it. Nobody knows the names of most of those soldiers. They were just regular garrison troops doing their job holding a position that should have fallen days earlier, and their stubborn refusal to give up might have saved the city. That's the kind of thing that happened over and over during those 2 months, small groups of exhausted, terrified men making the difference between survival and catastrophe. And the psychological warfare. Both sides used it. The Ottomans would fire mortars into the city, not trying to hit military targets, just lobbing explosives randomly into civilian areas to spread terror. They'd fire arrows with messages attached, promising that if Vienna surrendered, the people would be spared. Which was a lie, but a tempting one when you're starving and sick and afraid. At night, they'd beat their drums continuously, that rhythmic boom, 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 designed to prevent sleep to wear down the defenders' nerves. The Viennese fought back with their own psychological tactics. They'd ring church bells after successfully repelling an assault, a defiant message that they were still there, still fighting. They'd hang-captured Ottoman banners on the walls where the besiegers could see them. They'd shout insults in Turkish. Apparently the garrison included enough people who spoke the language, probably Hungarian refugees or prisoners who'd learned it. Small acts of defiance that said we're not broken yet. But make no mistake, they were getting close to breaking. By early September, the food situation was dire. The garrison's initial supplies had been calculated for maybe a month, maybe 6 weeks if they rationed strictly. They were past that now. People were eating things they normally wouldn't consider food. Horses were being slaughtered for meat, which was devastating because horses were valuable, and killing them meant the cavalry couldn't operate. But starving to death was worse. The ammunition situation was even more critical. Remember how I mentioned the defenders had to ration their cannon fire? They were down to firing each battery just a few times per day to conserve shot. Artillery crews would watch Ottoman positions that desperately needed to be targeted, but they couldn't waste ammunition on harassment fire. They had to save it for when the Janissaries charged when every shot counted. And the walls. Oh man, the walls were failing. Ottoman bombardment and mining had created multiple weak points. There were sections where the stone was cracked, where whole segments had collapsed and been hastily repaired with rubble and timbers. There were places where you could see through the wall to the other side. Military engineers were doing constant emergency repairs, shoring up breaches with whatever materials they could find, but it was like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. On September 6th, and remember this date because it's important, there was a moment that nearly ended everything. Ottoman miners had dug a tunnel right under one of the most critical sections of wall. They packed it with a massive amount of gunpowder and detonated it. The explosion was enormous. It not only breached the wall but created a ramp of rubble that the Janissaries could charge up. This was it. This was the breakthrough they'd been working toward for weeks. The Janissaries charged, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, pouring toward the breach, screaming their battle cries, knowing that if they got through this breach the city would fall. And they hit the breach right as the Habsburg forces were changing guard, pure luck, or maybe Ottoman intelligence had timed it that way. For a few seconds the defenders were caught off balance, the old shift leaving and the new shift arriving. But here's the thing about luck, it runs both ways. The Janissaries hit the breach just as both shifts of defenders were there. Not one shift. Both. Double the number of men, double the firepower, and they poured musket fire into that breach like a fire hose just tore the Ottoman assault apart. Bodies piled up on the rubble ramp. The assault wave broke. The Ottomans retreated, leaving hundreds of dead in the breach. That moment, that split-second timing, might have been the difference between Vienna holding and Vienna falling. If the Ottomans had attacked 30 seconds earlier or later, they might have faced half the defenders and broken through. But they didn't, and Vienna survived one more day. But by September, everyone in the city knew the end was coming. Not from victory, from collapse. The defenders were down to about 4,000 combat-effective troops from the original, 11,500. That's almost 2/3 losses. The walls were held together more by prayers than mortar. The food was nearly gone. The ammunition was nearly gone. Disease was rampant. Morale was somewhere below rock bottom. Starhemberg, the commander we talked about earlier, the one who'd sworn to fight to the last drop of blood, he sent a message to Leopold. The gist of it was, "We've done everything humanly possible. We're still here, but we can't hold much longer. Days maybe. If help doesn't come now, it's over." And the question on everyone's mind, the question that kept them awake at night, the question that mothers whispered to priests and soldiers whispered to each other was the same. Where is the relief army? Is anyone coming? Did Europe abandon us? Because that was the real terror, wasn't it? Not just that they might die, but that they might die for nothing. That they'd held out for 2 months, suffered through disease and bombardment and starvation, watched their friends and family die, all while hoping that help was on the way. And maybe it wasn't. Maybe Europe had decided Vienna wasn't worth saving. Maybe they were alone, but they weren't alone, and the answer to that desperate question was racing toward them at that very moment. An army was coming, a collection of forces that should never have worked together, led by a man who would go down in history as one of the greatest commanders of his age, was moving through the Vienna woods, getting closer every day. Vienna just had to survive a little longer, just hold on for a few more days. The defenders had no way of knowing this, but on September 6th, the same day as that desperate breach defence relief forces had crossed the Danube 35 kilometres away, help was coming. The question was, would it arrive before Vienna's last drop of blood was spilled? That's what we're talking about next. The assembly of the relief force. How Poland's king convinced Europe to care. How a multinational army that by all rights should have fallen apart from internal politics and rivalries somehow came together. And how they were about to attempt something that had never been done before, defeat the Ottoman Empire in a major field battle. So stay with me, because we're about to meet the heroes of this story, and trust me, they're going to earn that title. There's a name you need to know, and I guarantee you've never heard it before. His name was... Actually, we don't know his name. And that's exactly the point. Because the man who might have saved Vienna, who might have prevented the city from falling weeks before the relief army arrived, was just a baker. A regular guy who made bread for a living. And his story captures something essential about why Vienna survived when it absolutely shouldn't have. Here's what happened. It's sometime in late July or early August, maybe 3 or 4 weeks into the siege. This baker is working in his shop because yes, even during a siege, people need bread. He's down in his cellar, probably trying to get some flour from storage, and he hears something. A scraping sound. Rhythmic. Like someone digging. Coming from beneath the floor. Now most people would panic, right? Run upstairs, maybe pretend they didn't hear anything because knowing is terrifying. But this baker, this anonymous ordinary citizen, he goes to the military authorities. He tells them, there's digging under my shop. The Ottomans are tunnelling toward the walls, and I think their tunnel is going to pass right under my cellar. The garrison sends engineers to investigate. They dig down, and sure enough, there's an Ottoman mine tunnel, packed with men and tools and barrels of gunpowder, heading straight for a critical section of wall. If that tunnel had been completed, if the Ottomans had blown that section, Vienna might have fallen right there. But because one baker paid attention, because he reported what he heard, instead of freezing, in fear the defenders were able to countermine intercept the tunnel and stop that particular attack. And we don't know his name. There's no statue of him, no street named after him. He's just the Baker of Vienna in the historical record. But that guy, that one ordinary person doing the right thing at the right moment, he's the reason Vienna survived long enough to be rescued. That's the theme of this part of our story. Because when we talk about the defense of Vienna, it's easy to imagine it was all about the military garrison, the professional soldiers, the commanders, making brilliant strategic decisions. And yeah, that stuff mattered. But the real story is about regular people, shopkeepers and craftsmen and grandmothers and teenage boys who found courage they didn't know they had. Let me tell you about the garrison commander Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, because this guy deserves way more recognition than he gets. He was 43 years old during the siege, which was actually pretty old for a military commander in that era. He'd been a soldier his whole adult life, fought in multiple campaigns, seen plenty of action. But nothing had prepared him for this. Starhemberg had somewhere between 11,000 and 12,000 soldiers under his command when the siege began. Mix of regulars and militia, some cavalry, but mostly infantry and artillery crews. And he had to make these impossible decisions every single day. Where to position his limited forces, which sections of wall to reinforce, how much ammunition to allocate to each position, whether to attempt a sortie or conserve strength, when to pull troops from one crisis to deal with another. And here's what's remarkable, he made the right calls, over and over and over again. When Leopold fled his own emperor, abandoning the city, Starhemberg stayed. When food started running low and people suggested negotiating with the Ottomans, Starhemberg refused. When sections of wall collapsed and it looked hopeless, he rallied the defenders and they held. This guy was basically running on caffeine and sheer willpower for 2 months straight, making life or death decisions daily, watching his men die one by one, and he never broke. There's this moment I love about halfway through the siege. Starhemberg is doing his rounds, inspecting the defences, and he comes across a group of civilian volunteers. These are guys who aren't soldiers, just citizens who grabbed whatever weapons they could find and reported for duty. And they're exhausted. You can see it in their faces. They're standing at their post, but barely. They look like they might just collapse, and Starhemberg stops, takes off his fancy commander's hat, picks up a musket from one of the racks, and stands there with them for an hour. Just stands guard, shoulder to shoulder with these volunteers like he's one of them. Doesn't say much. Doesn't need to. The message is clear, we're all in this together. If you can stand, I can stand. That's leadership, not the grand speeches and the dramatic poses. Just showing up, being present, sharing the burden. And the volunteers, they kept fighting. Because if the commander could find the energy to keep going, how could they give up? Now let's talk about these civilian volunteers, because their story is wild. When the siege began, the garrison sent out a call for able-bodied men to help with the defence. They were hoping for maybe a few hundred volunteers. They got thousands. Bakers and blacksmiths, yes, but also university students, priests, merchants, farmers who'd fled to the city from the countryside, old men who could barely hold a musket, boys as young as 14 or 15 lying about their age to enlist. These people had no military training. Most of them had never fired a gun before. They didn't know tactics or formations or any of that. They just knew their city was in danger, their families were in danger, and they were going to do something about it. So the garrison gave them crash courses. This is a musket. This is how you load it. This is how you aim. Don't shoot your fellow defenders. Try not to shoot yourself. And then they put these volunteers on the walls mixed in with the regular soldiers and hoped for the best. And you know what they held? These civilians, these amateurs, they stood on those walls during bombardments and mines and assaults, and they fought like veterans. Not because they were naturally brave, I'm sure most of them were terrified out of their minds, but because the alternative was unacceptable. If they broke, their families died. Simple as that. There are these small stories scattered through the historical accounts that just break your heart. A butcher using his cleaver as a weapon when his musket jammed fighting hand-to-hand in a breach. A priest who put down his Bible, picked up a pike, and defended a section of wall while still wearing his vestments. A grandmother and I, kid you not, the records specifically mention a grandmother who helped carry ammunition to the artillery crews during an assault because the young men were all busy shooting. Think about that for a second. Your grandmother carrying heavy bags of gunpowder while cannonballs are exploding around her because somebody had to do it and the soldiers were busy. That's the level of desperation and determination we're talking about. And the blacksmiths. Oh man, the blacksmiths might have been the most valuable people in the entire city. Because weapons break, musket barrels crack from overheating, cannon crack from firing too many times, armour gets dented, tools wear out, and in a siege you can't just order new equipment from the capital. You're on your own. So the blacksmiths worked around the clock. They'd repair broken muskets, reforge cracked sword blades, patch armour, make new tools for the miners and engineers. They improvised weapons from scrap metal when supplies ran low. They were as essential to the defence as the soldiers on the walls, maybe more so. And they did it while the city was being bombarded, while disease was spreading, while food was running out. Just kept their forges burning and their hammers swinging. Can I ask you something? What's the longest you've ever worked without proper sleep? A couple of days, maybe. These defenders went weeks. Weeks of 4-hour sleep cycles if they were lucky. Most got 2 or 3 hours per night, often interrupted. Some of the artillery crews were running on pure adrenaline and spite for days at a time. The human body can do amazing things when it has to, but it extracts a terrible price. By mid-August, about a month into the siege, the garrison was starting to show serious cracks. Not in morale that stayed surprisingly high, but in capability. Men were making mistakes from exhaustion, falling asleep at their posts, having trouble remembering orders. One account describes a soldier who was so tired he fell asleep while reloading his musket standing up in the middle of a battle. Just checked out for a few seconds. His comrades had to shake him awake, and the wounded. God the wounded. In modern warfare, if you get injured, you've got medics, hospitals, antibiotics, surgery. In 1683, you had barber surgeons with dirty tools, no anaesthesia, except maybe some alcohol if you were lucky, and basically no treatment for infections. Getting wounded often meant dying slowly over days or weeks. The city's hospitals, and I use that term loosely, were overflowing. Churches had been converted into medical facilities. Private homes were taking in wounded soldiers, and the care they could provide was minimal. Clean the wound as best you could. Maybe cauterize it with a hot iron if it was bleeding bad. Wrap it in cloth. Pray it didn't get infected. That's it. That's all they had. So many soldiers chose to stay at their posts even with serious injuries because at least there they were useful. At least there they were fighting. In the hospital you were just waiting to die. I read one account of a defender with a shattered arm couldn't use it at all who stayed on the walls and learned to reload and fire a musket one-handed. Because what else was he going to do? Sit around and feel sorry for himself. Now let's talk about why Vienna succeeded, where Constantinople failed in 1453, because this is fascinating from a military history perspective. Constantinople had a lot of advantages. Vienna didn't have bigger walls, more defenders, initially natural protection from water on 3 sides. So why did Constantinople fall while Vienna held? 3 reasons. First, Constantinople was isolated. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire was basically just the city itself. No allies, no relief force coming. The defenders knew they were alone. Vienna. Vienna had hope. They knew that if they could just hold on long enough, help was coming from Poland, from Germany, from across Christian Europe. Hope is a hell of a drug. Second Constantinople's defenders were spread too thin, miles and miles of walls and not enough men to defend all of it properly. The Ottomans could probe the defences, find weak points, concentrate their forces there. Vienna was smaller, the walls were shorter. The defenders could mass their forces at threatened points more easily. It's actually easier to defend a smaller fortress if you have limited troops. Third, and this is crucial, Vienna had better gunpowder weapons. By 1683, musket technology had improved dramatically. Muskets were more reliable, faster to reload, more accurate than what Constantinople had in 1453. And that made a huge difference in repelling assaults. A defender with a good musket could shoot multiple times per minute, drop multiple attackers before they reached the breach. Constantinople's defenders mostly had bows and crossbows, not the same stopping power. But there's a fourth reason that doesn't get talked about enough: leadership. Constantinople's last emperor, Constantine XV, was brave. He died fighting on the walls when the city fell, but he made some strategic mistakes. Starhemberg didn't. Starhemberg was cautious, pragmatic, willing to adapt. He didn't waste his men on pointless counterattacks. He didn't try to hold indefensible positions out of pride. He fought smart, not just hard, and that made all the difference. Here's something that still amazes me. By early September, the garrison was down to about 4,000 combat-effective troops from the original 11,500. That's roughly 2/3 casualties. In any normal military situation, an army that's taken 60-70% casualties is finished. Done. They surrender or they break and run. But Vienna's defenders didn't. They kept fighting. Why? Partly because surrender meant death or slavery, so there was no attractive alternative, but also because of something deeper. These people, soldiers and civilians alike, had been through so much together. They'd shared the terror, the exhaustion, the disease, the hunger. They'd watched friends die. They'd pulled each other from collapsed tunnels and burning buildings. They'd become a community in the truest sense, people bound together by shared suffering and shared purpose. There's this concept in military psychology called unit cohesion. It's the glue that holds armies together when things get bad, and it's built through shared hardship. Vienna's defenders had unit cohesion in spades. They weren't going to let each other down. If their buddy next to them could keep fighting, they could keep fighting. Simple as that. And on September 6th, that date again, it keeps coming up when Starhemberg sent his desperate message saying Vienna couldn't hold much longer. He wasn't exaggerating. The city was at the absolute breaking point. But even then, even at the darkest moment, the defenders were still on the walls, still manning the cannons, still filling breaches, still doing their jobs. Because what else could they do? Give up, die without fighting. That wasn't an option. Not for Starhemberg. Not for the anonymous baker who discovered the tunnel. Not for the grandmother carrying ammunition. Not for the one-armed soldier who learned to shoot lefty. Not for the thousands of regular people who found themselves in an extraordinary situation and rose to meet it. These are the heroes of Vienna. Not the kings and generals who came later, we'll get to them, but the people who held the line when there was no glory in it, no fame, no promise that anyone would even remember their names. They held because someone had to, and that's the purest form of courage there is. But their ordeal was almost over. While they struggled through that first week of September, exhausted and depleted and barely hanging on, something was happening in the hills northwest of the city. An army was assembling, a coalition force that had no business working together, led by a man who was about to pull off one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history. The defenders didn't know this yet. They couldn't see the relief force gathering in the Vienna woods. They just knew they had to survive one more day, and then another, until help arrived or the walls finally came down. In just a moment, we're going to meet that relief force. We're going to talk about how Poland's king put together a coalition that shouldn't have been possible, how he convinced princes and generals to follow him, and how he was about to attempt something that had never been done before: defeat the Ottoman Empire's main army in open battle. So stay with me, because the rescue is coming, and it's going to be spectacular. Sometimes history turns on the most unlikely people saying yes when everyone expects them to say no. And in the summer of 1683, there was an 80-year-old man sitting in Rome, physically frail, politically embattled, facing opposition from all sides, who looked at the crisis in Vienna and made a decision that would change the course of Western civilization. His name was Pope Innocent, and he was about to do something that popes weren't supposed to do. He was about to become a military strategist, a financier, and a political operative all rolled into one. But here's the twist that makes this story so frustrating and so fascinating. He almost failed. Because the first person he asked for help, the most powerful monarch in Europe, the one guy who absolutely should have jumped at the chance to fight the Ottomans, that guy said no. And that decision nearly doomed Vienna before the siege even began. Let me paint you a picture of Pope Innocent I, because this guy doesn't fit the stereotype of what you'd expect. He wasn't some fire and brimstone preacher calling for crusades. He was a reformer, actually. He'd spent years trying to clean up corruption in the church, trying to improve relations with Protestant nations, trying to be, and I know this sounds weird for a pope, pragmatic. He believed in negotiation over confrontation, diplomacy over war. But when the reports started coming in about the Ottoman army marching toward Vienna, when he realised this wasn't just another border raid but an existential threat to Christian Europe, something shifted in him. This 80-year-old man who'd never commanded an army, who'd never even been in a battle, looked at the situation and thought, if I don't do something, nobody will. And if nobody does something, we lose everything. So he started making moves, political moves, financial moves, diplomatic moves that would make a modern campaign manager jealous. And his obvious first call, was to Louis XIV of France. Now, Louis XIV at this time was basically the superstar of European royalty. The Sun King, they called him. France was rich, powerful, had the best army in Europe, and Louis was Catholic, which meant he should have been all in on defending Catholic Vienna from the Muslim Ottomans, right? That's how it should have worked. But Louis said no. Not just no, he basically laughed at the request. Why? Because Louis hated the Habsburgs more than he feared the Ottomans. France and the Habsburg Empire had been rivals for generations. Louis was actually happy the Ottomans were attacking Vienna because it kept his enemies distracted. He apparently told his advisors, and this is one of those quotes that makes you want to reach back through time and shake someone, "Why would I help my enemies defeat my friends?" He called the Ottomans his friends. Let that sink in for a second. The most powerful Catholic monarch in Europe was essentially allied with the Ottoman Empire against fellow Christians because of political rivalry. That's not just cold-blooded politics, it's breathtaking in its cynicism. Pope Innocent V was reportedly furious, not the public diplomatic fury. The private seething, I trusted you and you betrayed everything we stand for kind of fury. But he couldn't dwell on it. Louis was out, fine, plan B. Except there was no obvious plan B. The Holy Roman Empire itself, Vienna's own government, was in chaos. Leopold had fled. The imperial forces were scattered. The German princes were squabbling among themselves as usual. Nobody wanted to commit troops and money to what looked like a losing cause. So Pope Innocent I did something radical. He turned to Poland. And when I say this was radical, I mean it was almost unthinkable. Poland wasn't a major power at this point. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was large, sure, but it was politically unstable, economically struggling, and hadn't fought alongside the Holy Roman Empire in, well, ever. These two powers had never cooperated militarily against the Ottomans before. Not once in 300 years of Ottoman European warfare. But Pope Innocent I had done his homework. He knew about Poland's King John III Sobieski, and he knew Sobieski was different. Let me tell you about Jan Sobieski, because this guy's one of the most interesting monarchs you've never heard of. He was 54 years old in 1683. He'd been king for 10 years, but before that he'd been a military commander his whole adult life. And he was good. Like really good. He'd fought the Ottomans before beating them in battles when he was outnumbered, earned this reputation as a tactical genius. But here's what made Sobieski special. He was a warrior scholar. This wasn't some brutal warlord who only understood violence. Sobieski spoke multiple languages: Polish, Latin, French, German, Italian, Turkish. He'd studied Ottoman military tactics, could read their manuals, understood how they thought. He wrote letters to his wife that were full of poetry and philosophy. He collected books. He was interested in science and astronomy. Picture this: a king who could quote Virgil in the morning and personally lead a cavalry charge in the afternoon. That was Sobieski. And when Pope Innocent and his emissaries reached him with their desperate plea, "Vienna is dying. Christian Europe is dying. Please help," Sobieski didn't hesitate. His response was essentially, "Yes, absolutely. When do we leave?" But, and this is where it gets complicated, Sobieski couldn't just decide to go to war. Poland's political system was, let's call it, uniquely democratic, for the time, which is a polite way of saying it was a bureaucratic nightmare. The king couldn't declare war on his own. He needed approval from the Polish parliament, which was full of nobles who all had to agree. And Polish nobles loved to argue. Can you imagine Vienna is under siege every day matters, and Sobieski has to spend weeks convincing a room full of aristocrats to let him go help? Some of them didn't want to get involved. Some of them wanted guarantees about what Poland would get in return. Some of them just enjoyed being difficult because it made them feel important. But Sobieski was persuasive. He gave speeches about Christian duty, about the Ottoman threat eventually reaching Poland if Vienna fell, about honour and glory in defending civilization. And slowly, painstakingly, he got them to agree. But it came with conditions. He needed money, lots of money, to pay for the campaign. And the Polish treasury was basically empty. So Sobieski did something extraordinary. He funded the war himself. He contributed about 500,000 zloty from his personal fortune. That's not pocket change. That's like a modern billionaire putting up hundreds of millions of dollars. He literally mortgaged his family's future on this campaign. If he failed, if he died, his wife and children would be in financial ruin. Think about that decision for a minute. You're the king of Poland. You're 54 years old, which is pretty old for a warrior in 1683. You're being asked to march into one of the most dangerous military situations imaginable, and you're betting your family's entire financial security on it. Would you do it? Could you do it? Sobieski did, and on August 15th, 1683, he left Krakow with about 27,000 Polish troops. And here's another crazy detail: he left Poland undefended. Completely. The entire Polish army was marching toward Vienna, and the country they were leaving behind had basically no military protection. Sobieski even sent a warning to the Prince of Upper Hungary, who was nominally allied with the Ottomans, saying essentially, if you take advantage of this situation and attack my country, while I'm gone, I will hunt you down and destroy you. And apparently the prince believed him because Poland wasn't attacked. Now, while Sobieski was assembling his forces, Pope Innocent III was working on the financial side, and this part is just genius-level political manoeuvring. He couldn't convince countries to contribute troops initially, but he could get them to contribute money. So he started this fundraising campaign across Catholic Europe. He hit up wealthy nobles, Catholic princes, even ordinary churches. Donate to the defense of Vienna. Protect Christendom from the Muslim threat. And people gave. Not out of pure charity, the Pope promised indulgences, spiritual benefits, political favours, but they gave. Hundreds of thousands of florins flowed into Rome, and Pope Innocent XIX channeled all of it toward funding the relief effort. He was basically running a military crowdfunding campaign 340 years before Kickstarter existed. And here's where it gets really interesting. The Pope started making deals. He negotiated with the Habsburgs, saying essentially, OK, Poland is going to save your capital, and in return Sobieski gets first rights to plunder the Ottoman camp if they win. That's right. The Pope negotiated looting rights. He also arranged that Poland would pay for its own troops while in Polish territory. But once they crossed into imperial lands, the Habsburgs would take over the costs. He worked out similar arrangements with Bavaria, Saxony, and various German states. By late August, early September, he'd somehow assembled a coalition that should never have existed. The numbers tell the story about 20,000 Austrian troops under Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, about 27,000 Poles under Sobieski, about 11,000 Bavarians under their elector Max Emanuel, about 9,000 Saxons under Elector John George III, about 8,000 from Franconia and Swabia under Prince Georg Friedrich von Waldeck, plus smaller contingents from other German states, total roughly 70,000 to 75,000 men, and they were all converging on Vienna at the same time, which in itself was a logistical miracle. Remember, this is 1683. No phones, no radio, no instant communication. Coordinating multiple armies moving through different territories to arrive at the same place at roughly the same time, that required planning, trust, and a bit of luck. But here's the real question. Why did this coalition work when it shouldn't have? Because these weren't natural allies. Austria and Poland had been rivals. The German states were always bickering with each other. Bavaria was practically independent and didn't love taking orders from Vienna. These people had no practice working together, no shared command structure, different languages, different tactics, different equipment. 3 reasons. First, existential threat. Everyone understood that if Vienna fell, they might be next. The Ottomans weren't going to stop at Vienna. This was self-preservation. Second, Pope Innocent IX's money. He'd essentially bribed everyone into cooperation. Not crude bribes, sophisticated financial arrangements that made participation worth everyone's while. But still, The money mattered. Third, Sobieski. This is the one that doesn't get enough credit. The coalition worked because everyone trusted Sobieski. Even Charles of Lorraine, who was technically the senior commander because it was Habsburg territory, agreed to let Sobieski take overall command. Why? Because Sobieski had a reputation. Everyone knew he was brilliant. Everyone knew he'd beaten Ottomans before. Everyone knew that if anyone could pull off a miracle, it was him. So on September 6th, 1683, while Vienna was fighting off that desperate breach attack we talked about earlier, the relief force crossed the Danube River at Tulln, about 35 kilometres northwest of Vienna. They were finally within striking distance. The mood in the army must have been complicated. These soldiers knew they were about to fight the largest Ottoman army anyone had seen in decades. They knew the odds were dicey at best. They knew a lot of them were going to die in the next few days. But they also knew, and this is crucial, they knew they were riding to the rescue. They were the heroes of this story. Vienna was waiting for them. All of Christian Europe was counting on them. The pressure must have been immense. And Sobieski. What was going through his mind? He'd bet everything on this moment, his money, his reputation, his life, his family's future. He was about to attempt something no one had successfully done in centuries: defeat the main Ottoman army in open battle. Every other time Christian forces faced the Ottomans in a major field battle, they lost. That was the historical pattern. The Ottomans were unbeatable in the field. But Sobieski had a plan. A crazy, audacious, probably shouldn't work plan. And in just a few days he was going to find out if his genius was real or if he just led 70,000 men to their deaths. September 11th. The relief army reached Kahlenberg Hill, the high ground northwest of Vienna. From there, they could finally see the city, see the Ottoman camp surrounding it, see the smoke from the bombardment, see the scale of what they were up against, and the soldiers. I wonder what they felt. Fear, determination. Both that night fires and flares were lit on Kahlenberg Hill. Signal fires visible from Vienna, and inside the city the defenders saw them. After 2 months of isolation, 2 months of wondering if anyone was coming, 2 months of holding on by their fingernails, they saw the fires, and new help had arrived. Can you imagine the emotion of that moment, the relief, the sudden surge of hope when all hope had seemed lost, but they weren't saved yet. The relief army had arrived, yes. But Kara Mustafa's army was still there, still massive, still dangerous. And now came the hardest part, actually fighting the battle, actually pulling off this rescue. Because getting there was just the beginning. The real test was still ahead, and that test was going to require perfect timing, perfect coordination, and a cavalry charge so massive, so unprecedented, that 3 centuries later people are still talking about it. That's what we're building toward. That's the climax of this entire story. But first we need to understand the race against time, the 6 days between the army's arrival and the battle itself. Because those 6 days, they were some of the most tense, uncertain, desperate days in military history. So stay with me. We're almost at the moment everything was decided, almost at the 3 hours that changed the world. But first we need to understand how 70,000 men from different countries, speaking different languages, using different tactics, somehow came together to pull off the impossible. That's next. That's where this story gets really good. You know what nobody tells you about being a hero? It's not just about courage or skill or having a brilliant plan. Sometimes it's about not strangling the other people on your team when they're driving you absolutely insane. And in the 6 days between September 6th and September 12th, 1683, the coalition army that was supposed to save Vienna nearly imploded from internal drama before they even fought the Ottomans. September 6th evening. The relief forces crossed the Danube at Tulln. They're 35 kilometres from Vienna. They can see the smoke rising from the siege. They've lit signal fires to let the defenders know help has arrived. Everything should be celebration and preparation, right? The heroes have arrived. Time to coordinate the rescue. Except, nobody can agree on anything. And I mean anything. Not the battle plan, not the command structure, not the timeline, not even which routes to take. For 6 days, while Vienna was bleeding out, the relief army was basically having a committee meeting from hell. Let me set the scene. You've got commanders from 5 different countries. Charles Stiff, Duke of Lorraine, he's the senior Habsburg commander. Technically, this is his territory. Max Emanuel of Bavaria, young ambitious, thinks he knows better than everyone else. John George III of Saxony, older cautious, worried about casualties. Georg Friedrich von Waldeck, commanding the Franconian and Swabian forces, politically connected, touchy about his authority. and Jan Sobieski, Polish king, overall commander by agreement, but still technically a guest in someone else's war. These men had never worked together before. They came from different military traditions, they had different tactical philosophies, they spoke different languages, literally some of them needed interpreters just to talk to each other, and they all had egos, massive egos, because you don't become a duke or an elector or a king without a pretty high opinion of yourself. The first major fight was about command authority. Yes, everyone had agreed Sobieski would have overall command, but what did that actually mean? Did the other commanders have to follow his orders exactly? Could they make independent decisions? Who had final say on tactics? This might sound like nitpicking, but in a battle these details matter. Confusion about command structure gets people killed. Charles of Lorraine was particularly touchy about this. This was Habsburg territory. His emperor's city was under siege, and now he was supposed to take orders from a Polish king. He agreed to it, yes, but he clearly wasn't happy about it. There are accounts of him and Sobieski having tense conversations where you could cut the atmosphere with a knife. But they worked it out. Sort of. The compromise was that Sobieski would design the overall battle plan and make strategic decisions, but the individual commanders would have tactical freedom with their own forces. It's like saying, we all agree on the destination, but everyone drives their own car. Not ideal, but better than nothing. Then came the second fight timing. When should they attack? Some commanders wanted to attack immediately, September 7th or 8th. Vienna was dying. Every day mattered. Just march down there and hit the Ottomans before they knew what was happening. But Sobieski said no, and his reasoning was actually solid. The army had just finished a forced march. The men were exhausted. The horses needed rest. They needed to scout the terrain, properly understand what they were dealing with, coordinate their forces. Rushing into battle when you don't know the ground is how you lose battles, the other commanders argued. Sobieski held firm, and eventually they agreed on September 12th as the attack date. That gave them 6 days to prepare, 6 days to scout, 6 days to rest and resupply, but also 6 more days that Vienna had to hold out. And nobody knew if the city had 6 days left in it. Now here's where it gets really interesting, and by interesting I mean the kind of drama that would make a great reality TV show if we could time travel. On September 11th, the Polish forces reached Kahlenberg Hill. This was the high ground northwest of Vienna, the position from which they'd launch their attack the next day. And Sobieski, who'd been working off maps and descriptions provided by Habsburg scouts, finally got to see the actual terrain himself. And he lost it. Just absolutely lost his mind. Because the terrain was nothing like what the maps showed. The maps depicted relatively gentle slopes, clear lines of sight, easy paths for moving troops and artillery. What Sobieski saw when he crested that hill was rough, broken ground covered in Vienna, wood-steep valleys, vineyards with their stone walls and fences, streams and gullies cutting across potential routes. Moving an army through that, moving cavalry through that was going to be a nightmare. Historical accounts describe Sobieski having what we'd politely call a heated discussion with the Habsburg officers who'd provided the maps. And by heated discussion, I mean he apparently yelled at them, questioned their competence, and declared that he needed to completely rethink the battle plan because fighting on this terrain was going to be way harder than anyone had anticipated. Can you imagine being in that meeting? The most important battle in recent European history is supposed to happen in less than 24 hours, and the commander is saying, actually everything we planned is wrong because you gave me bad maps. The stress must have been incredible, but here's what separates good commanders from great ones. Sobieski didn't just complain, he adapted. He spent the rest of that day and all night redesigning the battle plan to account for the terrain. He repositioned units, he changed the approach routes, he adjusted timing, and this is crucial, he negotiated with Charles of Lorraine to transfer some German infantry regiments to screen the Polish cavalry as they moved through the difficult ground. That last part is important. Sobieski's original plan had the Polish cavalry, including his elite winged hussars, charging down the hill relatively early in the battle. But with the terrain being so rough he needed more time to get them into position. So he asked Charles to lend him some German infantry units that could advance, first engaging the Ottomans and buying time for the cavalry to navigate the obstacles. Charles agreed. But it wasn't easy. Some of the German commanders were insulted. They felt like they were being used as expendable shields for Polish glory. There were arguments about honour, about risk distribution, about who would get credit for the victory. Adult men, experienced military leaders arguing like children over who gets to be the hero. Eventually they sorted it out. But it took hours of negotiation, political manoeuvring, promises about loot distribution and honours after the battle, all while the clock was ticking, all while Vienna was fighting for its life just a few miles away. And through all of this, there was another layer of complication. The multinational nature of the army created constant friction. The Poles had cavalry tactics that emphasized shock charges with heavy lances. The Germans preferred combined arms approaches with infantry and artillery support. The Austrians had experience fighting in the local terrain. The Bavarians had their own traditions. Getting all these different military cultures to work together was like, imagine trying to coordinate a group project where everyone speaks different languages, has different grading systems, and fundamentally disagrees about methodology. Now add life and death stakes. There were disputes about march order, who goes first, who guards the flanks. Disputes about supply distribution, who gets the fresh water, the best camping spots. Disputes about religious observances. The army was overwhelmingly Catholic, but there were some Protestant units, and scheduling around different religious practices got complicated. Every little decision became a negotiation. Have you ever tried to organise something with a group of people who all have strong opinions and nobody wants to compromise? Maybe a family vacation or a work project or planning a wedding. Now multiply that stress by 1,000 and add the knowledge that if you screw this up, an entire civilization might fall. That was the command team's reality for 6 days. But somehow, and this is what still amazes historians, they made it work. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but they made it work. And the key, I think, was that beneath all the ego and friction, everyone understood what was at stake. They might have argued about details, but they all agreed on the goal, say Vienna defeat the Ottomans or die trying. Let's talk about what was happening on the Ottoman side during these 6 days, because that's its own fascinating story. Kara Mustafa knew the relief army was coming. His scouts had spotted them. His Crimean Tatar cavalry, who were supposed to be his eyes and ears, had seen the coalition forces moving through the area. But Kara Mustafa made a critical decision. He decided to keep the majority of his forces focused on the siege. He left maybe 10,000 men in the trenches around Vienna, continuing the bombardment and assault. And he deployed the bulk of his army, somewhere around 60,000 to 65,000 men, to face the relief force. That seems reasonable, right? Use your numbers. Advantage, protect your siege works, fight on 2 fronts if necessary. Except here's what he didn't do. He didn't build serious defensive fortifications facing the relief army. Remember back when we talked about Kara Mustafa's mistakes? This was another big one. Basic siege warfare says you build 2 sets of fortifications, one facing the city you're besieging, and one facing outward to protect yourself from a relief force. But Kara Mustafa either didn't think he needed them, or didn't have time to build them properly, or just didn't prioritise it. So when the coalition army attacked on September 12th, the Ottomans would be fighting on relatively open ground without the defensive advantages they should have had. It's like a boxer going into a fight without his mouthguard because he didn't think he'd get hit in the face. And there's evidence disputed by historians, but intriguing, that Kara Mustafa's subordinates were questioning his decisions during these 6 days. That the Crimean Khan was arguing for different deployments. That Ibrahim Pasha was suggesting they should break off the siege and focus entirely on defeating the relief army. But Kara Mustafa overruled them. He wanted Vienna. He was so close. He'd spent 2 months on this siege, lost thousands of men, invested his reputation and his life in this campaign. He wasn't going to give up now. Pride, that's what it came down to. Kara Mustafa's pride wouldn't let him admit that maybe the situation had changed, maybe the smart play was to retreat and regroup, and that pride was about to cost him everything. But we're not there yet. It's still September 11th. The relief army's positioned. The battle plan is set mostly. The commanders have stopped arguing temporarily. The men are resting, checking their equipment, saying prayers, writing letters home that might never be sent. That weird calm before a storm where everyone knows tomorrow changes everything but nobody knows exactly how. In Vienna, the defenders can see the campfires on Keilenberg Hill. They know the relief army is there, but they don't know when the attack will come or if it will succeed. They're down to maybe 3,000 combat-effective troops at this point. The walls are barely standing. Food is almost gone. If the relief fails, if the battle goes wrong, they're finished. There's no backup plan. This is it. And in the Polish camp on Keilenberg Hill, there's a religious service happening. Father Marco Daviano, an Italian Capuchin friar who's been travelling with the army celebrating Mass in the ruins of St. Joseph's Church, which the Ottomans had burned weeks earlier. And serving at that Mass, kneeling like any other worshipper, is King Jan Sobieski himself. Think about that image. The commander of the entire relief force, the man on whom everything depends, kneeling in prayer the night before the biggest battle of his life, not trying to look tough or confident, just praying, asking for strength, asking for wisdom, maybe asking for forgiveness in advance for the killing that's about to happen. That's humanity right there. Beneath all the politics and strategy and ego, these were people. Scared people, faithful people. People who knew they might not see another sunset and were trying to make peace with that. September 12th would begin in just a few hours. At dawn, the coalition army would start moving down from the hills. The infantry would advance first, engaging the Ottoman positions, starting the battle that would decide everything. And later, hours later, after the infantry had fought and bled and bought time, the cavalry would make their move. 18,000 horsemen, the largest cavalry charge in recorded history, led by Sobieski and his Winged Hussars, thundering down a hillside covered in vineyards and forests and obstacles that should have made such a charge impossible. A charge so audacious, so magnificent, so utterly insane that people 3 centuries later still can't quite believe it worked. But that's not where we're going next. Before the charge, before the glory, before the moment that gets painted and sung about, there's the preparation. The dawn of September 12th. The quiet moments before the storm. The final prayers, the final checks of equipment, the final words between friends who might not both survive the day. That's where we're headed. Into the last peaceful morning any of these men would know. Into the calm before Vienna's fate and Europe's fate and the fate of everyone in this story all comes down to a few hours of combat that will echo through history forever. So take a breath, rest for just a moment, because what comes next is extraordinary. Dawn breaks differently when you know it might be your last one. September the 12th, 1683. The sun hasn't crested the horizon yet, but there's that grey pre-dawn light that makes everything look unreal, almost dreamlike. And on Kahlenberg Hill, in the burned ruins of what used to be St. Joseph's Church, something extraordinary is happening, something that's going to set the tone for everything that follows. Father Marco d'Aviano, this Italian Capuchin friar with a reputation for inspiring speeches and fearless faith, is preparing to celebrate Mass. And surrounding him, kneeling on the cold stones of this destroyed church, are the commanders and soldiers who are about to attempt the impossible. Poles and Austrians and Germans and Bavarians all together. For just a few minutes they're not warriors or enemies or political rivals. They're just people seeking blessing before walking into hell. And right there in the front, not standing apart, not on some elevated platform, not surrounded by guards, is King Jan Sobieski. On his knees, hands folded in prayer. The most powerful person in that army, the man everyone is counting on acting like the most humble servant. There's something profound in that image. Something that cuts through all the ego and politics we talked about before. Father Marco's sermon that morning has been preserved, at least parts of it. He spoke about David and Goliath, about how faith can overcome impossible odds, about how God doesn't need large armies to achieve victory. And apparently, and this detail always gives me chills, he said something like, "Today you fight not just for Vienna, not just for your kingdoms, but for civilization itself. God go with you." Can you imagine hearing that? Knowing that in a few hours you're going to be charging into an army that outnumbers you, that has every advantage, that has been undefeated for generations, and your spiritual leader is telling you that the fate of Western civilization rests on your shoulders. The weight of that moment must have been crushing, but also freeing, maybe. Because when the stakes are that high, when the cause is that clear, there's no room for doubt. You either do it or you don't. You either survive or you don't. All the complicated politics and personal ambitions fall away, and what's left is pure purpose. After the Mass, as the sun finally breaks over the horizon, the army begins its preparations. And this is where we need to talk about the Winged Hussars, because these guys are about to become legends, and you need to understand what made them so special. First, the name. Winged Hussars. You're probably picturing, I don't know, cavalry with little decorative wings or something. No. These wings were massive wooden frames, sometimes 6 feet tall, attached to the back of the saddle, or to the armour itself covered in eagle feathers. When a hussar was mounted and moving, these wings would arch up and over their head, creating this enormous silhouette that made each rider look twice their actual size. And the sound. Oh man, the sound. When hundreds of these hussars charged together, the wind rushing through those feathers created this haunting, whistling, roaring noise. Imagine hearing that coming toward you. The thunder of hooves, the screaming of men, and underneath it all this otherworldly sound like nothing you've ever heard. It was psychological warfare at its finest. The wings weren't just decoration. They were a terror weapon. But the hussars weren't just about intimidation. These were some of the most effective heavy cavalry in the world. Let me describe what a fully equipped winged hussar looked like, because it's almost unbelievable. Start with the armour, not the full plate armour of medieval knights that was too heavy, too restrictive. Hussar armour was lighter, more mobile, a breastplate and backplate called a carracina, maybe some arm guards, a helmet called a sissak that looked almost Turkic with its distinctive raised crest. The armour was decorated, we're talking engravings, gold inlay, ornate designs. These guys wanted to look magnificent on the parade ground and terrifying on the battlefield. Over the armour, many hussars wore animal skins, leopard pelts, tiger skins, wolf fur, partly for warmth, partly for protection, but mostly for the psychological effect. You're facing an enemy, and what you see is this figure that looks half human, half beast, with giant wings and gleaming armour charging at you at full gallop. Your primitive brain says, run. Now the weapons. Primary weapon, the copia, a hollow lance made from fir wood about 16 to 18 feet long. That's roughly 5 to 5.5 meters. These lances were designed to be disposable. They were engineered to shatter on impact, transferring all their kinetic energy to the target. A hussar would lower this lance at full charge, hit an enemy soldier or horse, and the lance would explode into splinters, doing massive damage. Then the hussar would drop the broken shaft and draw their sabre or their backup weapons. Secondary weapons, a sabla, the curved Polish sabre that could decapitate with a single swing. A pair of wheel-lock pistols, sometimes a warhammer or a horseman's pick for dealing with the armoured opponents, sometimes even a short bow. These guys were walking arsenals, and the horses, because none of this works without the right mount. Hussar horses were bred specifically for this role, strong enough to carry an armoured rider at high speed, smart enough to navigate obstacles, brave enough not to panic in battle. Training a hussar horse took years. These weren't just transportation. They were partners' weapon systems in their own right. So you've got 3,000 of these warriors, 3,000 armoured winged, lance-wielding killing machines, grouped together under Sobieski's personal command. They're the elite of the Polish cavalry, the finest heavy-shot cavalry in Europe, and they're about to participate in the largest cavalry charge in human history. But here's what's interesting, they're not charging yet. Because Sobieski's battle plan is actually quite sophisticated. The hussars are the hammer, but you need the anvil first. You need to fix the enemy in place, wear them down, create the perfect moment for that charge to be decisive. So the morning of September 12th begins not with cavalry, but with infantry. The plan Sobieski has worked out goes like this. The left wing, commanded by Charles of Lorraine, will attack first. Austrian and German infantry will advance from the north, hitting the Ottoman positions, engaging them, forcing them to commit troops. This is happening around mid-morning. At the same time, other imperial forces will push from different angles, creating multiple pressure points. The idea is to stretch the Ottoman lines, make them respond in multiple places, prevent them from concentrating their forces. Meanwhile, and this is the tricky part, the Polish forces will be moving through the Vienna woods on the right wing. Remember that terrain problem Sobieski discovered? The rough ground, the vineyards, the streams. Well, the Polish infantry will advance first, clearing paths, securing key positions, and behind them, protected and screened, the cavalry will be slowly, carefully positioning themselves. It's like, imagine you're setting up for a magic trick. The audience sees the obvious parts, the flourishes and misdirection, but the real magic is happening out of sight in the preparation. That's what Sobieski is doing. The infantry battle is the misdirection. The cavalry charge is the magic trick that nobody sees coming until it's too late. Now let's talk about what the Ottomans are seeing and thinking that morning. Because from Kara Mustafa's perspective, things don't look that bad. Yes, a relief army has arrived. Yes, he has to fight them. But he's fought coalition armies before. The Ottomans have been winning these battles for centuries. His force facing the relief army is somewhere around 60,000 to 65,000 men. The coalition has maybe 70,000. Not a huge numerical disadvantage. And Kara Mustafa's troops are positioned on decent ground, not fortified, as well as they should be, but decent. They've got artillery. They've got their elite janissaries. They've got cavalry, including the Crimean Tatars, who are excellent light cavalry. But here's Kara Mustafa's fatal mistake, the one that's going to haunt him. He's kept a significant portion of his janissaries in the siege trenches around Vienna. These are his best infantry, the troops you want in a major battle, and he's got maybe 10,000 of them still focused on the siege, instead of facing the relief army. Why? Because he can't let go. can't let. He's so close to taking Vienna, so tantalizingly close. If he pulls all his troops away from the siege, the Vienna garrison might sortie out, might disrupt his camp, might somehow escape. He can't accept that. His ego won't let him admit that maybe, just maybe, it's time to cut his losses and focus everything on defeating the relief army. So he tries to fight on two fronts. And in military history, fighting on two fronts, when you don't have overwhelming numerical superiority, is usually how you lose. But Kara Mustafa doesn't know this yet. The morning of September 12th, he's probably still confident. He's got good commanders, Ibrahim Pasha, various other pashas with their contingents. He's got the Ottoman war machine that's conquered half of Eastern Europe. And he's looking at this coalition army and thinking, we've beaten worse. The Ottoman soldiers are preparing too, checking their scimitars, their bows, their armour. The Janissaries are going through their rituals. These guys had their own traditions, almost cultish in their devotion to the core. The Sicily cavalry are saddling their horses. The artillery crews are positioning their guns. And somewhere in the Ottoman camp there are surely men who are nervous, who've heard stories about Polish cavalry, who know that Sobieski has beaten Ottoman armies before, who maybe have a bad feeling about how this day is going to go, but they're soldiers. They have their orders, they'll do their duty. Back on Kahlenberg Hill it's maybe 8 or 9 a.m. The mass is over, the prayers are said, the commanders have had their final briefing, the soldiers have checked and rechecked their equipment. There's this strange quiet the way there always is right before a battle starts. Not silent, you can hear thousands of men moving, talking, making final preparations. But there's a quality to the sound, a tension in the air that's almost tangible. Sobieski is moving among his troops, not giving grand speeches, those have already been given, just being present. A word here, a nod there. Letting his men see that he's calm, he's ready, he's confident. Leadership by example. And the Winged Hussars are preparing their ultimate ritual. There's this tradition, and historical accounts confirm this, that before battle the Hussars would sing a hymn called Bogorodzica, Mother of God. It's one of the oldest Polish songs, dates back to medieval times. Imagine 3,000 armoured warriors, these fearsome soldiers who in a few hours will be charging into the deadliest battle of their lives, singing a hymn to the Virgin Mary. The lyrics, roughly translated, go, Mother of God, Virgin, God-honoured Mary, give us what we ask for, hear our prayers. It's beautiful and haunting and sad and defiant all at once. And apparently you could hear it echoing across the hills that morning. 3,000 voices singing for protection, singing for courage, singing for victory or for a good death. Have you ever been part of something bigger than yourself? A moment where individual fear and doubt get subsumed into collective purpose. That's what's happening on that hill. These men, Polish and Austrian and German and Bavarian, they're scared. Of course they're scared, but they're together. And that makes all the difference. By around 10 a.m, the infantry battle has begun. Austrian and German forces are engaging Ottoman positions to the north. You can hear the roar of musket fire, the boom of cannon, the screams of wounded men. The battle has started. The die is cast. There's no turning back now, and on the right wing the Polish forces are moving. Infantry pushing through the Vienna woods, fighting skirmishers with Ottoman advance units, slowly, methodically clearing the way. And behind them, screened by trees and terrain, the cavalry is massing, finding their positions. The Hussars are mounting their horses, checking their lances one final time, adjusting their wings. Sobieski is with them. He's 54 years old, remember? That's old for a warrior. Most men his age are retired sitting by fires telling stories of their youth. But Sobieski is about to lead the largest cavalry charge in history personally from the front, because that's what kings did back then. That's what leadership meant. He's wearing his armour, not the ornate parade armour, but good functional battle armour. And over it reportedly a blue semi-oriental robe, a jupan that he'd taken from a previous battle with the Ottomans. A trophy, but also a symbol. I've beaten you before, and I'll beat you again. The hours pass, 11 a.m, noon. The infantry battle is raging. Men are dying. The Ottomans are holding their positions, but they're being pressed. They're having to commit more troops, stretch their lines. Everything is going according to Sobieski's plan, but nobody knows that yet. From the Ottoman perspective, this just looks like a standard pitched battle. By early afternoon, we're talking 2 or 3 p.m, the Polish infantry have secured the key heights. They've cleared paths through the worst of the rough terrain. They've engaged and pinned the Ottoman forces facing them, and now, finally, there's space. There's a clear line of sight down the hillside through the vineyards and forests toward the main Ottoman positions. At 4 p.m, a small group of 120 hussars make a probing charge. Just 120 testing the Ottoman defences, seeing how they'll respond. And they get torn apart, heavy casualties. But they prove something crucial: the Ottoman lines can be broken. They're vulnerable. They can be defeated by a massive cavalry charge if you have enough force behind it. Sobieski sees this, his commanders see this, and they know this is the moment. Everything has led to this. All the preparation, all the marching, all the diplomacy and politics and prayer, it all comes down to what happens in the next few hours. The order goes out. The cavalry will charge. All of it. 18,000 horsemen, in 4 groups, 3 Polish, 1 German. The largest cavalry charge in recorded human history. Down a hillside covered in obstacles that should make such a charge impossible. Against an enemy that's never been defeated this way. With the fate of Vienna, the fate of the Habsburg Empire, the fate of Christian Europe all riding on the outcome. And at the head of the charge, leading his 3,000 winged hussars, will be King Jan III Sobieski. A 54-year-old man who mortgaged his family's fortune, who left his country undefended, who negotiated and politicked and prayed his way to this moment. And in just a few minutes he's going to find out if faith and courage and brilliant tactics are enough to defeat an empire. The wings are adjusted. The lances are lowered to carry position. The horses are held in check barely because they can feel the excitement, the tension, the readiness. And somewhere someone gives the signal. It's time. And 18,000 horsemen begin to move. There's a moment, maybe you've experienced it, when time seems to slow down and speed up simultaneously. When everything becomes crystal clear and completely chaotic at the same time. When your heart is pounding so hard you can hear it over everything else, but somehow you're also perfectly calm. Athletes call it the zone. Soldiers call it the fog of war. And on the afternoon of September 12, 1683, 18,000 horsemen entered that moment together, and what happened next defied everything anyone thought was possible. It's around 6 p.m. The sun is lowering in the western sky, creating this golden light that makes everything look surreal. And somewhere on Kahlenberg Hill, King Jan Sobieski raises his hand. The signal. And 18,000 men see it, and they know this is it. This is the moment we've been preparing for. This is the moment that decides everything. The initial movement is actually slow, controlled. You can't just launch 18,000 horses at full gallop from a standing start. They'd trip over each other, crash into trees, break legs on rough ground. So the charge begins at a walk, then a trot. The cavalry is arranged in 4 massive groups, 3 Polish contingents and 1 from the Holy Roman Empire, spread out across maybe a mile of frontage, moving in waves. And the sound. Oh my God, the sound. Have you ever heard just one horse galloping? Multiply that by 18,000. The ground literally shakes. It's not a metaphor. Contemporary accounts from people miles away said they could feel the vibration through the earth, like a continuous rolling thunder that doesn't stop, just builds and builds. Now add the human sounds. 18,000 men shouting battle cries in Polish and German and a dozen other languages. Some are screaming to psyche themselves up. Some are screaming to terrify the enemy. Some are probably screaming because they are absolutely terrified, and noise is the only thing keeping them from breaking down. And underneath it all, for the Polish cavalry, that eerie whistling of the wings catching the wind as they pick up speed. Sobieski is at the front of his 3,000 winged hussars in the centre of the Polish formations. He's not hiding in the back, not directing from safety. He's leading the charge personally, his distinctive blue robe visible above his armour. Because that's what command meant in 1683. You didn't send men into danger, you led them into it. And they're moving downhill now, picking up speed, navigating terrain that should make this impossible. Because here's what the history books and paintings don't show you. This wasn't a clear open field. This was the Vienna woods, trees, undergrowth streams. And below that, vineyards covering the hillsides. Vineyards mean stone walls and wooden fences meant to keep animals out and mark property boundaries. These are obstacles, serious obstacles. Horses at full gallop can't just jump a 4-foot stone wall without breaking stride. But these cavalry units aren't at full gallop yet. They're managing their speed, finding gaps in the obstacles flowing around them like water. The infantry that cleared paths earlier has helped, but it's still a navigation challenge. Riders have to guide their horses over rough ground, through tight spaces, all while maintaining formation, all while the Ottoman artillery is starting to fire at them. Because the Ottomans aren't just standing there watching. They see this massive cavalry force coming down the hill, and they're responding. Artillery crews are swinging their guns around, firing into the mass of horsemen. Each cannonball that hits can take out multiple riders. A 3-pound iron ball moving at high velocity doesn't discriminate, it just plows through whatever's in its path. But artillery is slow to reload, and the cavalry is moving faster now. They're past the worst of the woods, entering more open ground. And at about 100 paces from the Ottoman lines, maybe 300 feet, maybe 90 meters, something changes. The commanders give the signal, and 18,000 lances come down from carry position to attack position. Try to picture this. Each lance is 16 to 18 feet long, that's like a 2-story building lying on its side, and suddenly you've got this forest of wooden spears, thousands of them, all pointing forward, all moving toward you at increasing speed. If you're an Ottoman soldier, this is what you see the sky getting darker, because there are so many horsemen and lances between you and the sun, the ground shaking harder with every second, the sound becoming unbearable, and you realize there's nowhere to run that's far enough. At 50 paces, maybe 150 feet, maybe 45 meters, the horses shift from canter to full gallop. And this is where training matters, because a war horse at full gallop carrying an armoured rider with a lance is basically an organic missile. Each one weighs close to half a ton, moving at maybe 25 to 30 miles per hour. The kinetic energy is enormous, and when that lance tip hits something, a shield armour, a human body, all that energy has to go somewhere. That's why the lances were designed to shatter. The wood splinters on impact, and all that forward momentum transfers to the target. It's not about piercing so much as it's about the sheer force of the impact. People get thrown through the air, shields get ripped from arms, the front ranks of the Ottoman defence basically disintegrate. And then the main body of the charge hits. 18,000 horses and riders all in motion, all committed, slamming into the Ottoman lines like a tidal wave hitting a beach. The front ranks of cavalry drop their shattered lances and draw sabres. The horses themselves become weapons trained to bite, to kick, to trample. The riders are swinging their sablers, those curved Polish sabres that can take off limbs with a single cut. For the Ottoman soldiers on the receiving end, this is pure nightmare. You can train for battle. You can prepare mentally. You can be a veteran of a dozen campaigns, but nothing prepares you for being hit by the largest cavalry charge in human history. The Janissaries, those elite infantry we talked about, they're trying to form squares, trying to present pikes and muskets, but there's just too much mass, too much momentum. The cavalry breaks through their lines like they're not even there. And once the line is broken, once cavalry gets into the rear areas of an infantry formation, it's over. Because infantry's advantage is formation standing together, presenting a unified front. But when cavalry breaks that formation, when you're surrounded by horses and riders, and death is coming from every direction, cohesion collapses, unit discipline breaks down, and soldiers start thinking about survival instead of fighting. The Ottomans start to run. Not all at once, it's not like a switch flips, but unit by unit, position by position, the Ottoman army begins to disintegrate. Some units try to stand and fight, some commanders try to rally their men, but the momentum is all wrong. The cavalry is through, behind them, around them, cutting off retreat routes, spreading chaos. And this isn't just the Polish charge. Remember, there are 4 separate cavalry groups. The German cavalry is hitting the Ottoman flank at the same time. The combined effect is devastating. It's not one breakthrough, it's multiple breakthroughs, all happening simultaneously, overwhelming the Ottoman command's ability to respond. Kara Mustafa, somewhere in this chaos, realizes his army's collapsing. Contemporary accounts say he tried to rally his personal guards, his Albanian bodyguards, to make a stand. And apparently they fought hard. These were loyal men, brave men. But one by one they were cut down. Sobieski's forces were pushing toward the Ottoman command position, and there was no stopping them. And finally someone, probably one of his surviving advisors, convinces Kara Mustafa that if he stays, he dies. And if the Grand Vizier dies on the field, the entire army will panic, and the retreat will become a massacre. So Kara Mustafa does something that probably haunted him for his remaining months of life. He grabs the sacred banner of the Prophet Muhammad that the Sultan had given him. He grabs what personal treasure he can carry, and he flees, just runs. Leaves his army, leaves his wounded, leaves his campaign, and tries to save himself. And with the Grand Vizier fleeing, whatever cohesion remains in the Ottoman army evaporates. The retreat becomes a rout. Soldiers are throwing down their weapons, stripping off armour, anything to run faster. The cavalry is pursuing, cutting down anyone they catch. It's brutal. It's bloody. It's the kind of chaos where you can't tell who's winning or losing. You can only see people dying. Inside Vienna, the defenders on the walls can see what's happening. They've been watching the battle all day, the infantry fighting in the morning and afternoon, and then this massive cavalry charge in the evening. And now they see the Ottoman camp in chaos, see their besiegers fleeing, see the relief army breaking through. And after 2 months of siege, 2 months of starvation and disease and bombardment, 2 months of wondering if they'd survive to see another day they realise it's over. They won, they survived. Count Starhemberg. The garrison commander orders the gates opened. The defenders sally out, these exhausted, wounded, half-starved men who've been fighting for 60 days. They pour out of the city to join the battle. Not because they need to, the Ottomans are already beaten, but because they've earned the right to be part of this victory, to personally see their enemies fleeing, to know for certain that the nightmare is truly over. The pursuit continues until well after dark. The coalition cavalry chases the fleeing Ottomans for miles. Some Ottoman units try to make stands, try to cover the retreat, but they're disorganised, demoralised, leaderless. The coalition forces cut through them. From the moment of the cavalry charge around 6 p.m. to the complete collapse of the Ottoman army and the capture of their camp, less than 3 hours pass. 3 hours. Let that sink in for a second. This massive army that had besieged Vienna for 2 months, that had seemed unstoppable, that represented the military might of one of the most powerful empires on earth, it was destroyed in less time than it takes to watch a movie. The Ottoman casualties were staggering. Estimates vary, but most historians put Ottoman dead at somewhere between 8,000 and 15,000, just from the battle itself. Another 5,000 to 10,000 were captured, and in the retreat toward Hungary over the following days and weeks, thousands more would die from wounds, disease, exhaustion, or attacks by local populations taking revenge for the earlier Ottoman raids. The coalition forces, by comparison, took relatively light casualties, maybe some 500 to 3,000 dead, though sources vary. It was as lopsided a victory as you could imagine, a complete, total, devastating defeat of the Ottoman army. And then came the loot. Oh man, the loot. Because when the Ottoman army fled, they left everything behind. 2 months' worth of supplies, artillery pieces, hundreds of cannon just abandoned, tents including the Grand Vizier's enormous command tent, which was basically a mobile palace, weapons, armour, and treasure. So much treasure. The Ottomans had come to conquer Vienna, and they'd brought the wealth to celebrate that conquest. Gold, silver, jewellery, ornate weapons, expensive carpets and silks. All of it just sitting there in the abandoned camp waiting to be claimed. And remember that deal Pope Innocent then negotiated? Sobieski had first rights to plunder. So the Polish forces swept through the Ottoman camp and just took everything of value. Sobieski himself went straight for Kara Mustafa's tent, and what he found there, I mean, you have to laugh at the irony. Kara Mustafa had been so confident of victory that he'd brought his finest possessions, his most valuable items, and now they were Sobieski's. The Polish king personally took the sacred banner that had flown over Kara Mustafa's tent, the one the Grand Vizier had fled with, but then apparently dropped or left behind in his panic. And Sobieski, ever the scholar with a sense of historical drama, wrote 2 letters that night. One to his wife, Maria Kazimiera, which was personal and emotional, telling her he survived the battle, was won, he was coming home. The other to Pope Innocent XIII, which contained one of the most famous lines in military history. He wrote, "Venimus vidimus Deus vitit." We came, we saw, God conquered. It's a deliberate reworking of Julius Caesar's famous Veni vidi vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. But Sobieski changed it. Not I conquered, but God conquered, giving credit to divine providence instead of taking personal glory. Whether he actually believed that, or whether it was political genius telling the Pope exactly what the Pope wanted to hear, we'll never know. But it was a perfect line, humble and triumphant at the same time. To the letter to the Pope, Sobieski attached that sacred banner from Kara Mustafa's tent. To his wife he sent something else, Kara Mustafa's stirrup. This golden, ornate stirrup that the Grand Vizier had used, and Maria Kazimiera took that stirrup and donated it to Wawel Cathedral in Krakow as a votive offering. You can still see it there today, hanging in front of an altar, a physical reminder of the day Poland saved Europe. The treasure was divided according to the pre-battle agreements, but there was enough for everyone. Polish soldiers made fortunes. German troops went home rich. Even ordinary soldiers in the coalition army took home Ottoman weapons and armour and artefacts that would become family heirlooms passed down through generations. And in Vienna that night, for the first time in 2 months, people could sleep without hearing cannon fire, could walk their streets without fear of bombardment, could open their doors without wondering if this was the day the walls came down. The siege was over. The Ottomans were gone. They had survived. But survival came with a price. The city was devastated. Buildings were destroyed. The walls were barely standing. Disease had killed thousands. Starvation had killed more. The economic damage would take years to repair. But they were alive, and sometimes that's the only victory that matters. As for the fleeing Ottomans, they weren't out of danger yet. The retreat to Hungary became its own nightmare coalition. Cavalry harassing them, local populations attacking stragglers, disease spreading through the disorganized mass of refugees. Kara Mustafa made it to Belgrade, but he knew what was waiting for him there. Knew that failure of this magnitude had only one consequence in the Ottoman system. And in Vienna, in the ruins and the rubble, in the aftermath of the greatest siege and the greatest cavalry charge in European history, people were just beginning to understand what they'd witnessed. That this wasn't just a military victory. This was a turning point. This was the moment when the Ottoman Empire's expansion into Europe ended, when the tide turned, when the future changed direction. But turning points have consequences, victories have costs, and the ripples from those 3 hours on September 12, 1683 would spread across empires and decades. The price of failure, the spoils of victory, the long shadow that this single day would cast over the next century of European history. That's what we need to talk about next, not just what was won, but what it meant. Not just the battle, but the aftermath that shaped the world we inherited. Winning is supposed to feel good, right? You save the day, you're the hero. You get the parade and the gratitude and everyone loves you. Except that's not how it worked for Jan Sobieski. Because when he rode into Vienna on September 13th, the day after single-handedly saving Christian Europe from Ottoman conquest, the reception he got from the people he'd rescued was complicated. And that complication tells us something profound about human nature, about politics, about how victory isn't always what it seems. Let me paint you the scene. September 13th, 1683. Vienna's gates open, and King Jan Sobieski rides into the city he just saved. The common people, the citizens who've survived 2 months of hell, they're going absolutely crazy. Cheering, crying, throwing flowers, trying to touch his horse, his armour, anything. They're calling him their saviour. Some are literally kneeling in the streets as he passes. This is their hero. This is the man who kept them alive. But then Sobieski meets Emperor Leopold II, the emperor who fled his own capital 2 months ago, the emperor who took the silver and jewels but left his people to die. And Leopold's greeting is cold, formal, technically correct but emotionally distant. Historical accounts describe it as received him coolly and with manifest superiority. Manifest superiority. The guy who ran away is acting superior to the guy who saved his capital. Why jealousy? Pure petty jealousy. Because everyone, and I mean everyone in Europe, knew who the real hero of Vienna was. It wasn't Leopold, it was Sobieski. And Leopold couldn't stand it. His ego couldn't handle being upstaged, being shown up, being made to look weak and cowardly by comparison. So instead of gratitude, he gave Sobieski the cold shoulder. Politics at its most human and most pathetic. Sobieski, to his credit, handled it with grace. He didn't make a scene, didn't demand recognition, just did his job, collected his promised share of the loot, and prepared to return to Poland. But you have to wonder what he was thinking. I just saved your entire empire, left my own country, defenceless, spent my personal fortune, risked my life, and this is the thanks I get. History doesn't record his private thoughts, but I bet they were colourful. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, another man was dealing with the consequences of September 12th in a very different way. Kara Mustafa had fled to Belgrade, and he absolutely knew what was coming. In the Ottoman system, failure of this magnitude had only one possible outcome, but he tried anyway. He tried to save himself. His first move was blame shifting. Classic move, right? When you screw up, find someone else to take the fall. Kara Mustafa started executing his subordinate commanders. Ibrahim Pasha, the Beylerbey of Buda, the guy who'd objected to attacking Vienna in the first place, the guy who'd been right, Kara Mustafa, had him executed. Blamed him for the defeat. Said it was Ibrahim's fault, the army broke Ibrahim's fault. They lost Ibrahim's fault that the campaign failed. He executed other officers too. Anyone who might report back to the Sultan about Kara Mustafa's mistakes, his arrogance, his refusal to listen to advice, they had to go. Kara Mustafa was trying to control the narrative, eliminate witnesses, make it look like he'd done everything right, and his subordinates had failed him. But Sultan Mehmed IV wasn't stupid. He had his own sources of information. He had spies, independent report survivors who told him what really happened. And the more Mehmed heard, the angrier he got, because this wasn't just a military defeat. This was a humiliation. The Ottoman Empire, the empire that had been expanding for 300 years, that had conquered Constantinople, that had been the terror of Christian Europe, had been decisively, catastrophically beaten. And the whole world knew it. The contemporary Ottoman historian Sildar Findiklili Mehmed Aga, whose name is a mouthful but his writing is crucial, he described the defeat at Vienna as the most disastrous since the foundation of Ottoman statehood in 1299. The most disastrous. In almost 400 years of Ottoman history, this was the worst defeat they'd ever suffered. Let that sink in, and Mehmed IV knew who was responsible. On Christmas Day, 1683, December 25th, exactly 3 months and 13 days after the siege began, Sultan Mehmed IV's emissaries arrived in Belgrade with orders for Kara Mustafa's execution. Now, the Ottoman method of executing high-ranking officials was specific and symbolic. They used a silk cord. Strangulation with silk was reserved for nobles, for people of rank. It was considered more honourable than beheading or other methods. But don't mistake more honourable for pleasant. This was still execution. This was still death. The historical accounts of Kara Mustafa's final moments are detailed and heartbreaking regardless of how you feel about the man. His executioners came to him in the palace at Belgrade. They presented the Sultan's decree. And Kara Mustafa, who'd been so arrogant, so confident, so convinced of his own genius, said 2 things. His last words recorded by witnesses, "Am I to die?" and then when they confirmed it, "As God pleases." As God pleases. Even at the end maintaining some dignity, some acceptance of fate. Whether he believed it or whether it was just the training of a lifetime how an Ottoman noble was supposed to face death, we'll never know. But those were his last words. The execution itself was brutal. Multiple executioners on each end of the silk cord pulling in opposite directions. It wasn't quick. It wasn't peaceful. And when it was done, they cut off his head and sent it to Constantinople on a silver dish. A gift to the Sultan. Proof that justice had been served. Kara Mustafa was 49 years old. He'd risen from the son of a cavalry soldier to Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire. He commanded armies, governed provinces, wielded power that most people can't imagine. And he died on Christmas Day because his ego had convinced him he could conquer Vienna, and his pride wouldn't let him admit when he was wrong. But here's the really tragic part for the Ottoman Empire. I mean, killing Kara Mustafa didn't solve their problems. It didn't undo the defeat. And it actually made things worse, because now the empire didn't just have a military crisis, it had a leadership crisis. In the 20 years following 1683, the Ottoman Empire went through 12 different Grand Viziers. 12. That's an average of less than 2 years per Grand Vizier, and most of them didn't leave office peacefully. They were executed or forced out or died under suspicious circumstances. The position became cursed. Nobody wanted it because taking the job meant inheriting an impossible situation and probably dying for it. And while the Ottomans were going through this political chaos, the Holy League, that coalition that defeated them at Vienna, smelled blood in the water. Pope Innocent of Aventine, who'd organised the relief of Vienna, now organised something bigger, a sustained counterattack. The Holy League officially formed with the Habsburg Empire, Poland, Lithuania, Venice, and eventually Russia, and they went on the offensive. For 17 years, 1683 to 1699, the Holy League waged war against the Ottoman Empire, and they won. Not every battle, not every campaign, but the overall trajectory was clear. The Ottomans were losing ground. Territory they'd held for generations was being reconquered. Hungary, most of which had been Ottoman for over a century, was recaptured by the Habsburgs. Transylvania, which had been an Ottoman vassal state, became Habsburg territory. Croatia, Slavonia, parts of Serbia, all conquered or reconquered by the Holy League. In the Mediterranean, the Venetians took back territories in Greece and Dalmatia. The numbers tell the story. By the time the dust settled, the Ottoman Empire had lost roughly 200,000 square kilometres of territory in Europe. That's about the size of... Let me put this in perspective. That's roughly the size of the entire United Kingdom. Gone in less than 20 years, and it culminated in the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. This treaty is one of the most important documents in European history, and most people have never heard of it. Here's what it did. It officially recognised that the Habsburgs now controlled Hungary, Croatia, and Transylvania. It confirmed Venetian gains in Greece and Dalmatia. It established new borders that fundamentally reshaped Central and Eastern Europe. But more than the specific territorial changes, the Treaty of Karlowitz represented something symbolic. It was the first time in Ottoman history that the empire signed a treaty as the defeated party, giving up significant territory with no realistic hope of getting it back. For 300 years, the Ottoman Empire had been expanding. Every treaty, every peace agreement had been signed from a position of strength, often gaining territory, or at least maintaining the status quo. Not this time. This time they were the losers, and everyone knew it. The psychological impact on the Ottoman Empire was devastating. For generations, Ottoman soldiers and citizens had believed in the empire's destiny to expand, to conquer, to eventually rule the world. That narrative, that story the empire told itself was shattered. If they couldn't take Vienna, if they lost Hungary, if the Christians were pushing them back, then maybe the empire's best days were behind it. Maybe decline was inevitable, and they were right. From 1683 onward, the Ottoman Empire never seriously threatened Central Europe again. There would be more wars, more conflicts, but the tide had turned permanently. The empire would limp along for another 235 years until its final collapse after World War I. But it was dying slowly from 1683 onward. Let me ask you something. Have you ever made a decision? One single decision that set off a chain reaction you couldn't stop? Maybe you said something you can't take back or made a choice that closed doors you didn't realize would close. That's what Kara Mustafa did. His decision to attack Vienna, his refusal to build proper defences, his pride that wouldn't let him adjust his strategy. Those choices didn't just cost him his life. They cost his empire its future. And here's the dark irony. The Ottoman defeat at Vienna probably accelerated the empire's decline more than any Christian military campaign could have done alone, because it exposed Ottoman weakness at a moment when the empire couldn't afford to look weak. It emboldened enemies who'd been cautious. It demoralized supporters who'd believed in Ottoman invincibility. It created political chaos at the top that prevented effective response. If Kara Mustafa had just not attacked Vienna, if he'd stuck with the Sultan's original orders to capture border fortresses, if he'd built defensive works when the relief army appeared, if he'd listened to his subordinates who told him the plan was flawed, if. History is full of these moments where one person's choices ripple outward to affect millions. Meanwhile, back in Vienna, life was slowly returning to normal. The walls were being repaired, the dead were being buried, the disease was being contained, trade was resuming. But the city was different. Darker, scarred. Both literally buildings were destroyed. Neighbourhoods were ruined and psychologically. Everyone who'd lived through the siege carried that trauma. And throughout Europe, people were trying to understand what had happened. This wasn't just a military victory. This was a cultural moment. Churches held services thanking God for deliverance. Artists painted dramatic scenes of the battle. Poets wrote verses about Sobieski's charge. The story of Vienna's rescue became part of European mythology almost immediately, but mythology simplifies. It turns complex events into simple narratives. Hero saves city, good defeats evil, God protects the faithful. The reality was messier. Vienna survived because of an anonymous, Baker-exhausted defenders, backroom political deals, Ottoman mistakes, lucky timing, and yes, Sobieski's brilliant cavalry charge. It was all of that together. Not one thing. Not one hero, a combination of factors that barely held together long enough to work. And the cost. We can't forget the cost. Tens of thousands dead Ottoman, Austrian, Polish, German civilian soldier. Entire regions devastated by the campaign. Families destroyed, lives ruined. Even in victory, even with Vienna saved, the human cost was staggering. The Holy Roman Empire, especially the Habsburg part of it, became the dominant power in Central Europe after 1683. Vienna transformed from a besieged city on the frontier to the secure capital of an expanding empire. The Habsburgs would rule Central Europe until World War I, and their rise to dominance starts at Vienna in 1683. Poland-Lithuania, despite Sobieski's heroics, actually declined after 1683. The country had overextended itself, spent resources it couldn't afford, and the political system remained dysfunctional. Sobieski returned home a hero, but couldn't translate that into lasting reform. Poland would be partitioned out of existence within a century. The hero who saved Europe couldn't save his own country, and the Ottoman Empire. It endured. It adapted. It modernized slowly, painfully. Often too little too late. But it survived for another 2.5 centuries, which is remarkable in itself. But after 1683, the question wasn't, how far will the Ottomans expand? It was, how long can they hold on? That's a profound shift. The world that emerged from September 12, 1683 was fundamentally different from the world that existed on September 11th. A single day, a 3-hour cavalry charge, one man's mistakes and another man's brilliance. And the entire trajectory of 2 continents shifted. But the story doesn't end with politics and empires and treaties, because the legacy of Vienna 1683 is still with us today. The myths it created, the questions it raises, the lessons we can learn or fail to learn, the ways this 342-year-old event still echoes in our modern world. That's what we need to explore finally, because history isn't just about what happened. It's about what it means, what it teaches us, and why it still matters. And trust me, Vienna 1683 still matters more than you might think. Walk into any cafe in Vienna today, any one of them, and you'll see people sipping coffee. Rich dark Viennese coffee served with a glass of water and maybe a pastry. It's part of the city's identity now. UNESCO even recognised Vienna's coffeehouse culture as an intangible cultural heritage. But here's the thing that makes me smile every time I think about it. Vienna's entire coffee culture, this thing that defines the city today, exists because of the Ottoman army abandoning their supplies when they fled on September the 12th, 1683. The story goes that when the coalition forces swept through the Ottoman camp, they found hundreds of sacks filled with these strange brown beans. Nobody knew what they were. Some thought they were animal feed. Some suggested burning them. But there was this Polish officer, or maybe he was Austrian, the legends vary, named Franz Georg Kolschitsky, who'd spent time in Ottoman territory and recognised coffee beans. And he basically said, "Wait, don't throw those away, those are valuable." So Kolschitsky claimed the coffee as his share of the loot, opened Vienna's first coffee house, and started a tradition that's lasted over 340 years. Now historians debate whether this exact story is true or embellished. Kolschitsky was a real person, but the details get fuzzy. But true or not, it's delicious irony, isn't it? The Ottomans came to conquer Vienna, failed, and accidentally gave the city one of its most beloved traditions. Sometimes the most lasting victories come from unexpected places. And coffee isn't the only food legend connected to the siege. There's the croissant, that flaky crescent-shaped pastry. One popular story claims it was invented in Vienna in 1683 to celebrate the defeat of the Ottomans. The shape is a crescent like the symbol on Ottoman flags. Bakers supposedly created it so Viennese could symbolically eat their enemies every morning at breakfast. Now, this story is almost certainly false. There are references to similar pastries in Austria before 1683, and the croissant as we know it was probably perfected in France much later. But the fact that people wanted this story to be true tells us something. It shows how deeply the Siege of Vienna embedded itself in European cultural memory. People wanted to commemorate it, celebrate it, keep it alive through everyday rituals. Same thing with bagels. There's a legend that bagels were invented in Vienna in 1683 as a gift to King Jan Sobieski, shaped like a stirrup to honour his cavalry charge. Is it true? Probably not. There are references to similar bread in Poland earlier. But again, people wanted it to be true. They wanted their daily bread to connect them to that moment when Europe was saved. Have you ever noticed how the foods we eat, the drinks we consume, they carry stories? Sometimes those stories are myths. Sometimes they're simplified versions of complex truths. But they matter because they keep history alive in our daily lives. Every time someone in Vienna orders a coffee, they're participating in a tradition that connects back to 1683, whether they know it or not. But the legacy of Vienna isn't just culinary. Walk through the city today, and you'll find physical reminders everywhere. There's a golden cannonball hanging outside number 11 on Amhof Square, an actual Ottoman cannonball from the siege preserved as a reminder. The city still digs up cannonballs occasionally during construction projects. These aren't museum pieces in glass cases, they're just there, part of the landscape. The Augustiner Kirche, the Augustinian church, has a plaque commemorating the mass that Sobieski attended after lifting the siege. You can stand in the exact spot where the man who saved Vienna knelt in thanksgiving. That's powerful. That's history you can touch. On the Ringstrasse, near the main university building, there's the Liebenberg Monument honouring Johann Andreas von Liebenberg, Vienna's mayor during the siege. Most people walk past it without noticing. But he was there. He kept the city administration functioning while everything was falling apart. Sometimes the quietest heroes get the smallest monuments, and Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, the garrison commander who refused to surrender, who fought to his last drop of blood, He has a statue outside Vienna's city hall, standing there in his armour looking eternally vigilant. Kids probably play around that statue every day without knowing who he is or what he did. But he's there, still watching over the city he saved. The Kahlenberg Hill, where Sobieski's army assembled, you can visit it today. There's a church there rebuilt after the Ottomans burned the original, and inside that church is a small museum about the battle. They have artefacts, paintings, documents, and on the anniversary every year, September 12th, there are ceremonies. People remember. What strikes me about all this is how Vienna chose to remember, not with massive triumphalist monuments glorifying war, not with statues of defeated Ottomans or scenes of violence, but with subtle reminders. A cannonball here, a plaque there, a tradition of coffee, its commemoration with a light touch. This happened. It was important. We survived. Now let's have a pastry and move on. But the legacy goes deeper than monuments and food. The Siege of Vienna became foundational to European identity in ways that still echo today. For better and worse, it became a symbol of Christian Europe standing against the Muslim East. That narrative that framing it shaped European consciousness for centuries, and we have to be careful with that legacy. Because yes, Vienna in 1683 was absolutely an existential crisis for Christian Europe. That's historically accurate. But the story has also been misused to justify prejudice, to promote fear, to create divisions. In 2017, far-right groups in Europe literally referenced the Siege of Vienna in their anti-immigration rhetoric. They held rallies on September 12th. They invoked Sobieski's name to support policies he probably would have found baffling. That's the danger of history. It doesn't stay in the past. It gets weaponized, it gets simplified into slogans. And something as nuanced and complex as Vienna 1683 with its political intrigues, its reluctant heroes, its mix of courage and cowardice, its Ottoman soldiers who were just following orders, and Christian defenders who were just trying to survive, it gets reduced to us versus them. So when we talk about the legacy of Vienna, we have to hold multiple truths at once. Yes, it was a crucial defensive victory that preserved European independence. Yes, Sobieski and the defenders showed incredible courage. And yes, the Ottoman Empire was an aggressive expansionist power. All of that is true. But it's also true that the Ottoman Empire was one of the most advanced civilizations of its time, that it contributed enormously to art, science, architecture, literature, that many of the Turkish soldiers at Vienna were actually Christians from the Balkans, conscripted or converted, that the lines between European and Ottoman were blurrier than modern narratives suggest, that this was politics and power, not some cosmic battle between good and evil. History is complicated, and Vienna 1683 is a perfect example of how a single event can be both a genuine moment of heroism and a tool for later propaganda. Both things can be true. We can honour the courage of the defenders while rejecting attempts to use that courage to justify modern prejudice. So what lessons can we actually take from Vienna 1683? What does this 342-year-old story teach us that matters today? First, unity is hard, but it's possible. That coalition army shouldn't have worked. Poles and Austrians and Germans and Bavarians, all with different languages and traditions and rivalries, somehow coordinating a complex military operation with 6 days preparation. They argue they fought, they nearly fell apart, but they made it work because the alternative was unacceptable. When the stakes are high enough, people can overcome their differences. Not easily, not perfectly, but they can do it. Second, leadership matters. Sobieski's tactical brilliance. Starhemberg's stubborn defence, Pope Innocent X's diplomatic genius, these weren't inevitable. Different leaders might have made different choices and Vienna might have fallen. Individual decisions, individual courage, individual wisdom. These things echo through history in ways we can't always predict. Third, arrogance kills. Kara Mustafa had the numbers, the position, the resources, but his ego wouldn't let him listen to advice, wouldn't let him adjust his strategy, wouldn't let him admit when things weren't going according to plan. And his arrogance destroyed his army, his empire's momentum, and ultimately himself. That's a lesson that transcends time and culture. Fourth, the heroes are often ordinary people. That anonymous baker who heard the digging, the grandmother carrying ammunition, the volunteers who'd never held a musket before but stood on the walls anyway. They weren't warriors or nobles or trained soldiers. They were just people who found themselves in an extraordinary situation and decided to act rather than surrender. That kind of courage, quiet, unglamorous, necessary that's available to anyone. And fifth history doesn't end. Vienna 1683 wasn't the final chapter of Christian-Muslim relations or European-Ottoman relations or anything else. It was one moment in an ongoing story that continues today. The Ottoman Empire is gone, but Turkey exists. The Habsburg Empire is gone, but Austria exists. Poland was erased from the map for over a century, but came back. History keeps moving, keeps changing, keeps surprising us. Here's something that always gets me. In modern Vienna, about 8% of the population is Turkish, or of Turkish descent. Turkish restaurants, Turkish businesses, Turkish communities are part of the city's fabric now. The descendants of the people who besieged Vienna in 1683 are now Viennese citizens contributing to the city's culture and economy. That's not irony. That's progress. That's history moving beyond old conflicts into something more interesting and more human. And Turkey today, it's a NATO member. A secular democracy, complicated, yes, facing challenges, yes, but fundamentally allied with the West, not opposed to it. The idea that Turkey and Austria would be military allies, that they'd be on the same side, would have seemed impossible in 1683, but it happened. Because history doesn't trap us. We can choose different paths. I think about that a lot. How the conflicts that seem eternal, the divisions that seem unbridgeable, the hatreds that seem permanent, they're not. They can change. Vienna and the Ottoman Empire were locked in existential combat for generations, and now their successor states are partners. If that can change, what else can change? The night of September 12th, 1683, the first night in 2 months when Vienna could sleep in peace, must have felt like the end of the world. Like they'd survived the apocalypse. And in a way they had. But it wasn't the end. It was a turning point. One moment in a much longer story. And that's true for us too, isn't it? The crises we face, the challenges that seem insurmountable, the moments when we're not sure if we'll make it through, they're not endpoints, they're chapters. We survive them or we don't. We make good decisions or we make terrible ones. We find courage or we give in to fear. And then history keeps going, and eventually someone will look back at our moment and try to understand what it meant. So as we close this story, this journey through the summer and autumn of 1683, through sieges and cavalry charges and political intrigues and human courage and human failure, I want you to think about what resonates for you. Maybe it's Sobieski's leadership. Maybe it's the anonymous baker's vigilance. Maybe it's the defender's stubborn refusal to give up. Maybe it's the lesson about unity or the warning about arrogance. Whatever speaks to you, hold on to it. Because that's how history stays alive. Not through monuments or textbooks, but through the stories we remember and the lessons we carry forward. Vienna survived, Europe continued, the Ottoman Empire eventually fell, as all empires do, but the moment the 3-hour window when 18,000 horsemen charged down a hill and changed the world, that moment remains. Preserved in metal cannonballs and coffee traditions and painted canvases and written accounts. Preserved in the choices we make when we decide to stand firm or to adapt to lead, or to follow, to remember or to forget. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for spending these hours exploring this moment in history. I know it's late, or maybe it's early where you are. I know you could be doing anything else. But you chose to spend this time learning about people who lived and fought and died over 3 centuries ago. That matters. That means something. And if this story spoke to you, if it made you think or feel or see something differently, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment. Tell me what resonated. Tell me what you'll remember. Tell me if you'll look at coffee differently now, or if you'll think about Vienna when you face your own challenges, or if you'll remember that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the stakes are high enough. I'll be back soon with another story from history, another moment when everything changed, another lesson from the past that matters today. I don't know yet what that story will be, but I promise it will be worth your time, because history isn't just about dates and battles and dead people. It's about us. It's about the choices we make, the courage we find, the legacy we leave. Until then, sleep well, dream well. And remember, sometimes the fate of the world really does come down to 3 hours on a hillside, and the courage of people who refuse to give up. Good night.